From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, and finally, in every nook and cranny of the land, Americans have gone forth to choose the 41st president, and also to pass judgment on a third of the Senate, their congressman, in many cases their governor, and the state assembly, not to mention a whole range of referendums put on the ballot by citizens everywhere. We have been watching the exit polls all day long, and as of now, the presidential election is tighter than anticipated in more places than anticipated. It may not stay that way, but that's the way it is at this hour. Virtually all the polls have already closed in 2 states, and ABC News therefore now projects that in the state of Indiana, George Bush has won the presidential contest there with its 12 electoral votes, and he has also won in the state of Kentucky with the 9 electoral votes that he adds to his column there. Well, throughout our election night coverage, ABC's Lynn Sherr will be watching the results from our exit polls. Thus, she is the one who will tell us from time to time what the raw numbers actually mean. So let's go to her for a start. Lynn, for a start, who is voting and for whom and on what basis so far?
Well, Peter, as you know, we're going to be reporting the results of our polling of about 50,000 people nationwide. But in those 2 states you just called, we can tell you that the results show that George Bush is winning on his background and on leadership. In the state of Kentucky, more voters said that experience was the most important factor in choosing a candidate. Let's take a look at the numbers. Of those people who said experience was the most important factor, 93% voted for Bush, only 7% for Dukakis. The second most important personality characteristic for Bush was strong leadership. Of those who said that was an important factor, 56% voted for Bush, 44% for Dukakis. But it has not been all smooth sailing for all Republicans tonight, and we will be looking at ticket splitting around the country. Right now, let's take a look at Indiana. As Peter pointed out, that's a state that we have called for George Bush. But of those Bush voters, 28% deserted the Republican and voted for the Democrat, Evan Bayh, for governor. We expect we will be seeing more of that, and we'll be telling about it as it comes up. In both Indiana and Kentucky, finally, the national economy, a very important factor in voters' choices. And that's an early look, Peter. Much, much more to come.
Okay, Lynn, thanks very much. Lynn has an enormous number of numbers to balance throughout the evening. Vice President Bush has spent a relatively quiet day in Houston after having gone to the polls with Mrs. Bush early this morning. And that's where our ABC's Britt Hume is tonight. Britt?
George Bush performed the last obligatory ritual of the campaign today, filling out his ballot. But when he paused to solemnly thank poll workers, he caught a little grief from Mrs. Bush.
Thank you all for what you do, I'll tell you.
Listen, Tom, move it on there. A lot of other people want to vote today.
Outside, Bush greeted a friend, then sized up the friend's companion.
Who's that up there? She looks like she's 18. Get her in there.
Bush's staff had the jitters this morning because an overnight poll taken by the campaign had shown a drop in Bush's lead. How did he feel?
Nervous. Always. Every time I vote here, I feel nervous.
Speaking of nerves, Bush was asked in an interview with ABC News how he had stayed calm in the crisis over his vice presidential selection that had seemed to threaten both the GOP convention and his campaign.
I knew enough about it to know that a lot of the charges against my running mate have been so brutally unfair that I knew everything would work out.
Bush said he actually enjoyed defending Dan Quayle, especially at a VFW convention right after New Orleans.
I love that kind of thing. I like it. I don't care what the odds are. And I think maybe the American people sense there's a certain maybe strength that comes with that. But I liked going there.
Bush will like coming here to this ballroom even better later tonight, assuming the large lead that he built by mid-October holds up. To protect it, the campaign made some slightly frantic last-minute stops in key states. Stops the campaign is no doubt glad it made tonight. Peter?
Britt, you mentioned the phrase jitters. I'd actually heard that some people in the campaign woke up in a cold sweat this morning. Is that putting it too strongly?
Well, they had a bad overnight poll, and it showed a sharp drop down to something like 3 points. Now, I'm not sure what the composition of that poll was, Peter, but there were some very nervous people in the Bush camp this morning. Much relieved to hear that as the day wore on that he seemed to be doing okay.
Okay, Britt, thanks very much. Look forward to talking to you many times throughout the evening. Saying it is wonderful to be home, Governor Dukakis arrived back in Boston today after a relentless 48-hour campaign push across the country. But even after he voted, he wasn't through campaigning. Here's Sam Donaldson.
Michael Dukakis voted this morning at a polling place at a housing project 2 blocks from his Brookline home.
I voted for Mike Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen, proudly.
That's right, and we're very proud of you.
No surprise there. And this afternoon, Dukakis and his son John went power walking in the neighborhood. Nothing new there. Except, consider this. At 4:30 this morning, Dukakis was standing in the freezing cold at the airport in Des Moines.
It's great to be home in Iowa.
Still pitching hard as he flew back from California and an incredible 48 hours of non-stop campaigning. An hour or so later, he was doing the same thing in the rain at the airport in Detroit.
Hello, Michigan.
And finally, back in Boston, bone-weary though he was, Dukakis was still projecting the same public opinion poll-defying optimism that has marked these closing days.
Tonight, we're not only going to surprise a few people, but we're going to be doing the celebrating.
Would another week have helped?
Well, I don't know. This isn't the day to talk about what we would have liked to have or what might have been. This is a day to be hopeful. It's election day. It's a great day in this country, and I am very hopeful.
Still hopeful, but still pitching. At this hour, Dukakis is in a television studio here doing satellite interviews with local stations in such key states as Ohio, Wisconsin, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Colorado, and California. Some stations have turned him down out of fairness to Bush, but he'll now talk to anyone who'll have him. Peter?
Sam, is this election day enthusiasm, the likes of which we've seen, or is this a realistic appraisal that they can pull it out?
Well, Peter, I've got to tell you, all along, as the polls have shown him down, I've looked for signs that they've given up, that they know that the end is here. And I haven't found them, and I don't find them today. I think Dukakis and his people still think there's a chance he can win.
Okay, Sam, thanks very much, and we'll talk to you throughout the evening. In a moment, we'll have the other races for the Senate and the House and the governor's chairs as our election night coverage continues.
This is World.
Well, as we said, the polls have now closed in Indiana, and we have a projection now in the race for the Senate in Indiana. ABC News is projecting that the Republican incumbent, Richard Lugar, is the winner there, defeating the Democratic challenger, John F. Wicks. That is no surprise at all. Richard Lugar returned to Washington. Nationwide, 1/3 of the Senate, 33, are up for grabs. Most observers believe that when all the votes are counted, control of the Senate is likely to remain with the Democrats. ABC's Jim Wooten is going to monitor today's Senate races for us. Jim?
From Senator Mitchell up in Maine to Senator Matsunaga in Hawaii. In 15 states, Democrats defending their seats today were all running ahead when voting began this morning. In contrast, in 12 states where Republicans are seeking re-election, 2 of them, Chick Hecht of Nevada and David Carnes of Nebraska, are thought to be in trouble. Carnes, appointed just last year, is running substantially behind Bob Kerrey, a Vietnam War hero and former governor. In Nevada, Hecht is being seriously challenged by Democratic Governor Richard Bryan. In New Jersey, incumbent Democrat Frank Lautenberg still favored in late polls despite a hard charge from Republican Pete Dawkins in one of the year's nastiest races.
I'm saying that you said you want to turn it into a barroom brawl, and you've succeeded in doing that.
There are a half dozen open seats in today's voting, 3 now held by Republicans, Washington, Vermont, and Virginia, and 3 by Democrats, Wisconsin, Mississippi, and Florida. Virginia looks like a switch. Former Democratic Governor Charles Robb should replace retiring Republican Paul Tribble. But so does Mississippi, the other way. Republican Trent Lott for retiring Democrat John Stennis. In Florida, Republican Connie Mack may win retiring Democrat Lawton Child's seat by hitting hard at Democrat Buddy McKay with commercials like this.
Hey, buddy, you're liberal.
And in the state of Washington, where Republican Dan Evans is retiring, it's a cliffhanger between Republican Slade Gordon and Democrat Mike Lowry.
Even with a few surprises thrown into the mix, the philosophical complexion of the Senate probably isn't threatened by what's happening today, because although there are a few unswerving liberals on one side of the aisle and a few true blue conservatives on the other, the Senate is becoming an increasingly centrist, middle-of-the-road little club. And today's returns aren't likely to change that. Peter?
Thank you, Jim. Speaking of no change, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives will be contested as always. As ABC's Barry Serafin reports, however, when the election is over, most of those seats will be filled with the same people.
The new House of Representatives is expected to look a lot like the old one, leaving the Democrats with a comfortable majority. There are only 27 races where no incumbents are running. 408 House members are seeking re-election, and nearly all of them are expected to win. Still, some incumbents could be in trouble.
Good to see you. How y'all doing?
Leading the list, Georgia Republican Pat Swindle, indicted for lying to a grand jury about considering a loan financed with laundered drug money. Swindle has labeled his Democratic opponent, former Dukes of Hazzard star Ben Jones, as a wife-beater and alcoholic. In Rhode Island, Democratic incumbent Fernand St. Germain, chairman of the House Banking Committee, is shadowed by ethics questions regarding meals and entertainment provided by lobbyists for the savings and loan industry. There are some notable retirees. Jack Kemp, who gave up his seat to run for president. Peter Rodino, who chaired the Judiciary Committee that voted to impeach Richard Nixon. And Edward Boland, who wrote the amendment cutting off military aid to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. But most House members are staying put, and they have huge advantages. As of mid-October, incumbents had raised 5 times as much money as challengers, and incumbents got 10 times as much from political action committees.
There will be a push for campaign finance reform when the new Congress convenes, but there will be one big problem. The only people who could change the system are those who now benefit from it. Peter?
That money will be one of the things to talk about later this evening. Roughly 1/4 of the states are choosing governors today, 12 of them. And in Indiana, ABC News now projects that the Democratic candidate Evan Bayh, son of the former Senator Birch Bayh, will defeat the Republican candidate John Mutz. That is to succeed the retiring Republican Governor Robert Orr. In a moment, we'll get out the 88 vote as our election night broadcast continues. And just before our major election broadcast begins this evening, a few words on polls and how we intend to use them this evening.
Are you currently registered as a Democrat, registered as a Republican?
The polls we have conducted so far in the campaign have given us a couple of things. A statistical photograph of how the electorate felt at the time, and a base of information which helps us know what to expect today, barring a major surprise.
Would you like to participate in the ABC News survey?
Today, as people have been leaving those places where they've cast their vote, many have been telling our exit pollsters much more about themselves, why they voted in a particular way, and what issues motivated them. As we build a model from those exit polls, which we've been doing all day, the shape of victory or defeat may become clear. It may not be enough, however. In order to project a winner in a state when the race is very close, we need more information, and so we go to another level. We look at the political history of the state. That tells us how people have voted in the past. We tabulate the actual vote today from key precincts, those precincts which reflect the voting history and the demographic makeup of a neighborhood or a district. Here's an example. At the beginning of the broadcast, we projected that Bush and Quayle would win the state of Indiana. In the first place, we know that Indiana has voted Republican in every presidential election except one since 1936. Throughout the day, the exit poll showed a consistent 10 to 15 point margin for Bush. Incidentally, had the margin been closer, we would have then had to see if the key precincts were decisive. And if they were not, we would have had to wait until most of today's actual ballots were counted. If a national election is particularly one-sided, that will become evident fairly quickly. And if that is the case, there are more than enough electoral votes in the East and the Midwest to decide who the next president is going to be. If, on the other hand, the national race is close, a candidate may not have put together enough electoral votes in the East and the Midwest, and naturally the West will be decisive. The West will also be as crucial to the model which we are building with our exit polls and key precincts as it is to the real election. And there is this to remember: even though we are sometimes able to decide who has won in a state on the basis of exit polls alone, after all, when was the last time that Utah went for a Democrat? We do not project a race until the polls have closed in that particular state and the real vote has begun to be tabulated. That's our report on World News Tonight. In just a couple of minutes, I'll be joined by David Brinkley for our full-scale election coverage of Election Night 88. Hope you'll stay with us. I'm Peter Jennings in New York.
From the ABC News Election Night Command Center, this is the 88 Vote.
Good evening, I'm Peter Jennings along with my colleague David Brinkley. It is now 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, and the majority of polls have now closed in 3 more states. So ABC News is now in a position to make 3 more projections. And here is a big one. In the state of Ohio, We project that George Bush has won the 23 electoral votes there. This is a key Midwestern state for any Republican presidential candidate. It has gone with the winner in 21 of the last 23 elections. We also project that in North Carolina, George Bush is the winner with the 13 electoral votes there, very much helped by an improving economy. In North Carolina, it's only gone to the Democrats once in the last 5 elections. We project that in West Virginia, Michael Dukakis is the winner of the 6 electoral votes there. That's an important state for Dukakis. Had he lost there, the early signs are for the rest of the nation he would have been in some difficulty. Here's what the electoral vote overall looks like at this point in time. 270 needed to win. Bush has 123, and Michael Dukakis has, as of now, 6. The polls have also closed in Vermont, as we pointed out not too long ago, but that race in Vermont is still too close to call. And some people did call to tell us that the polls were still open in Indiana. We project when the majority of polling places in a state have closed, and of course the majority of polling places, David, in Indiana have been closed for about 45 minutes.
88% of it.
Oh, that was good. Thank you.
Now, I have some projections for the candidates for the United States Senate, beginning in West Virginia, where Robert Byrd, Democrat, who has been the Senate Majority Leader, this will be his 6th term. He is retiring as Majority Leader because I think he wants more time for his country fiddle playing, which he's said to be very good at. He's supposed to play a great version of Red River Valley. Now in Ohio, for the Senate, Howard Metzenbaum, who's a Democrat already in the Senate, has been reelected. He defeated George Voinovich, who's the mayor of Cleveland. It was a bitter, expensive fight. Metzenbaum won it. In North Carolina, the governor, James Martin, a Republican, reelected. This is the 2nd Republican governor since the Civil War and the first one ever to win a 2nd term. Again in West Virginia, in the race for governor, the winner is Gaston Caperton, the Democrat. He defeated Arch Moore, a Republican who has been governor 3 times. That's the Senate and governors up to this moment.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the American electoral process. This is the 88 Vote. Now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center in New York, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
David, I would argue that a couple of those Senate races are worth talking about now, particularly in Ohio, where George Voinovich, who was the mayor of Cleveland, very popular mayor of Cleveland, helped that city come back from default. Decided early on, for reasons clear only to himself, he was going to run a very mean and nasty campaign against the Democrat incumbent Howard Metzenbaum. When John Glenn finally showed up with a testimonial to Metzenbaum, it seemed to be all over. But I wonder if that tells us anything this early in the evening about the quality of negative campaigning in '88.
Well, if George Bush wins, and we don't know yet, it will tell something about negative campaigning, because his certainly was. What he says in response to that is that the Democrats started it at their convention in Atlanta by kicking him around, talking about his silver foot in his mouth and so on and so on. I don't know. If it turns out that all of the negative campaigners win, who knows what will happen next time.
The other thing I think worth commenting on is in West Virginia, where Senator Byrd is going to step down as the Senate Majority Leader if the Democrats retain control of the Senate, as most people expect him to do. He hasn't, I gather, been very popular in that job. He's going to go to appropriations.
Well, he's worked very hard. He's done favors. That's how you get to be Majority Leader and how you keep the job once you get it, doing favors. And he's done that. Get a good parking space in the Senate garage is worth almost anything in Washington. You can have your way if you control the parking. He's going to the Appropriations Committee, where he could do a good deal for West Virginia because they pass out the money.
Okay, let's pass on to ABC's Lynn Sure, who's up on the second deck with the latest on what those exit polls are telling us. Lynn?
Peter, you talked about Ohio. We have some information about what happened there tonight. George Bush won the white vote. He won the male vote. He split the women's vote with Mike Dukakis. What George Bush did not do was win all those so-called Reagan Democrats. Those are the Democrats who defected to Ronald Reagan in '80 and '84. Let's take a look at the numbers. As of our information, George Bush won only 43%. That's less than half of the Reagan Democrats, Mike Dukakis winning 56%. Now, the reason that's important is he didn't do as well, but Dukakis, by rights, should have won them all, so that contributed to the Bush victory. Now, who are these Democrats? Right now, we're going to call them Bush Democrats, because when you look at these, he's inherited them, and he gets to call them his at this point. 37% of them said abortion was an important issue to them. 29% said the death penalty. 21% said the Pledge of Allegiance. And the Bush Democrats care more strongly about these issues than do all other Democrats in Ohio. One other point we have picked up, we talked about ticket splitting. 1/4 of George Bush's voters voted for the Democrat Metzenbaum for the Senate. So, gentlemen, another example of George Bush following in Ronald Reagan's footsteps, but perhaps with a slightly smaller footprint in Ohio. Gentlemen?
Okay, Lynn, thanks very much. I was up in Ohio the other day on a sort of race we did around the country. And Ohioans take great pride in
as
being...
if you were running for office for a few
I was
days.
certainly running for a while. It is one of those linchpins there in the Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois, which either candidate has got to put together in terms of getting a Midwest strategy, which really gives them that elasticity to push on towards the West. Talking about campaigns, let's go to Boston, where Sam Donaldson is standing by with Paul Broadus, the man who ran much of the Dukakis campaign. Take it away, Sam.
Well, Peter, Paul Broadus is the general chairman and good friend of Michael Dukakis. He must be exhausted after this last 48 hours of no sleep.
Well, I think it's very exhilarating right now. It's exciting. This is what we've been working for the last 20 months.
Well, I don't want to throw a wet blanket on it, but we have just declared that George Bush is likely to win Ohio. Can you put together enough electoral votes without that key state?
Yes, we can. We've looked at our numbers. We're looking at the reports as they come in across the country. And there are a number of states where we are very, very competitive that we believe we can win. If we win them, we're going to have 270 electoral votes.
Well, just a few minutes ago, the governor was in a studio, I understand, here doing satellite interviews with local anchor people. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I think, look, people are still voting in the Midwest and in the West. The message can still be delivered right up to the closing time. We found that our trip across country the other night to Cleveland and to St. Louis and then into Detroit this morning was very helpful, energizing the voters and getting the voters out. What's happening, Sam, is that the people are going into the voting booth today and are asking themselves a question, particularly those who haven't made up their mind, and they're saying, who's on my side? Who's going to best represent me for the next 4 years?
Well, now, that's your theme. That's the theme that the governor finally settled on for the last 3 weeks or so, and apparently it's been effective. Why didn't you develop a theme like that in late August, in early September, when it might have really been something that did you some good?
Well, I think you got to have more than a theme. You have to establish the base. You have to create the building blocks, and those are the issues. Health insurance for 37 million Americans that don't have health insurance. College educational opportunity for high school students who can't go to college because they don't have the money. That's what we talked about in September. And now the theme is being tied into those building blocks, the substantive issues, and I think that's what's making the undecided voters, the late deciders, move to Dukakis and Benson tonight.
Mr. Broadus, it's Peter Jennings in New York. We were talking about Ohio a moment ago. In Cleveland the other day, your local Democratic people told me that you'd ignored them in Cleveland. Jesse Jackson said today that you tried to land without a crash landing in the last couple of days, but had ignored your base in the country. You must have some sense of that from all your workers around the country.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, there's only so much you can do, but we worked hard in Ohio. We have a very good organization in Ohio. They've been working very hard today to get out the vote, and I don't agree with that. On the other hand, you have to go with some of your strength, and we've been concentrating on those states where we are very, very competitive, where we can win them, and I think that you're going to see some very interesting results tonight.
Mr. Broadus, in the last 2 or 3 days, your campaign, the governor's campaign, has been impressive, I would say almost superhuman, going all day and half the night, or all the night. If he had started his campaign energetically earlier, you think this might not have been necessary?
Well, I think what happens, at least my experience, is that the voters begin to make up their mind after Labor Day and, in fact, start to focus very seriously in the last 3 weeks. That's when we picked up the energy in this campaign. That's when Michael Dukakis came fighting back, and I think the timing has been very good.
We shall see, Mr. Broadus. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It is early in the evening, and we'll remind you just a few minutes ago we called West Virginia for Governor Dukakis, but we called Ohio. Governor Dukakis, like George Bush, went to Ohio 9 times in the course of this campaign. Mr. Broadus said what a key it was. We have projected that Ohio, with its 23 electoral votes, is going to go for George Bush, and no matter how you cut it, that hurts. We'll be back right after these messages.
88 Vote, ABC News election night coverage will continue in a moment.
I don't know how much there's going to be amusing tonight, but we thought this was kind of amusing to begin with. This is, I suppose, in the category of hedging your bets, if someone can get a good early look at that. That is the latest book on George Bush, the next president of the United States. And here is, oh no, don't go away, folks. Here is exactly the same book on Michael Dukakis, the next president of the United States. The publisher, I've forgotten whom it is, but was absolutely determined that tomorrow morning we would all wake up and have the benefits of one or the other. So David,
let me see.
Somewhere in a warehouse in New York, there are a lot of books ready to go on sale and a lot of books ready to be trashed.
This is $12.95. I have never known political propaganda to come at any price. Usually it's free.
I gave you two for $6.
I'm already flooded with it. Thank you.
You're welcome. There are, of course, 33 Senate races tonight. A third of the Senate is up, and ABC's Jim Wooten is the man who's going to watch the Senate races for us this evening, and he is in the magnificent Russell Rotunda. Am I right, Jim?
You're right there, Peter. What I'm doing is standing about 60 feet across this rotunda from the great Senate caucus room, which, among other things, was the scene of the investigation into the sinking of the Titanic. I don't think we're looking at anything quite that so dramatic in the Senate tonight, because of those 33 seats that are up for grabs, 18 of them belong to Democrats now, 15 belong to Republicans. 6 of them, however, are open. What we're looking at really so far tonight, we've called 5 races, 2 for Republican incumbents and 2 for Democratic incumbents. And we've seen only one change in the open seat. That's with Chuck Robb in Virginia. The power of the incumbency, as Barry noted, for congressmen in the House, is very, very potent. It's very, very difficult to get a guy out once he's in here. And I expect there won't be a great many pieces of drama and upset tonight. We could look, however, for one change. That would be in Nebraska, where Bob Kerrey may beat the Senator David Carnes. Chick Heck, the senator in Nevada, is in a bit of trouble. And let's keep an eye on Montana.
All right. Why do we want to keep an eye on Montana?
Oh, well,
I'm sorry about that.
Well, you know, John Melcher there, who is the Democrat, is expected to win very big. That may not be the case. There are some signs out there that a fellow named Conrad Burns, who's the Republican, who was miserably underfunded, he's a very popular farm broadcaster out there, is doing a great deal better than anybody expected.
Jim,
yes.
How could anyone vote against Dr. Melcher? He is a commercial which involves 2 cows talking to each other. He is a, what do you call an animal doctor? What's it called?
A veterinarian.
A veterinarian. And nobody else could have made a commercial like that.
Well, at least that's not negative advertising,
No.
David.
I want to know if anybody's seen it. The Republicans haven't,
I haven't seen it.
haven't elected a senator in Montana since, what, 1946, I think.
Something like that.
Okay. Jim, tell us a little bit more about what are the other races out in California. I know it's early out there, but there's a very interesting race in California for the Senate. There's another one in Florida.
It is the most expensive race in the country, Peter. $24 million spent between Senator Pete Wilson and the Lieutenant Governor of California, Leo McCarthy. One thing that's very interesting about that race is that the seat that Senator Wilson now holds has never been given to an incumbent since 1952. I think it's 6 senators have held that seat in the last 29 years. That doesn't bode well for Senator Wilson. It's much too early to look at the returns out there, although the early returns were showing Lieutenant Governor McCarthy doing a lot better than people expected. In Florida, you've got another very, very close race between Congressman Connie Mack, who's a conservative Republican, and between Buddy McKay, who's a Democrat who says that he's in the mainstream and Congressman Mack is in the extreme. Congressman Mack, as you know, is the grandson of the baseball immortal Connie Mack or Cornelius McGillicuddy.
Okay, Jim, thanks very much. We'll come back to you. We're talking about money. George Voinovich in Ohio, who lost to Howard Metzenbaum, the incumbent, spent $7.1 million down the tubes in that particular one. And Florida, the reason we haven't been able to call that race in Florida, it's too close yet, even though the polls in Florida closed some time ago. Standing by with us very briefly now, and I can't even tell you where he is, I'm sorry to say. He's in Atlanta, thank you very much, is Senator Sam Nunn, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Nunn, thank you very much for joining us. It has not looked, even before tonight, particularly good for Democrats in the South. What's the problem?
We have no IFB.
He just, at that second, David, lost the ability to hear us. If we can get him back, we will come back.
We'll try later, because
Okay.
he's worth the trouble. Very prominent member of the Senate, much admired, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was talked about as a possible candidate for president if he refused to run.
And certainly talked about very much as a vice presidential candidate
That
when
too.
Governor Dukakis got it
That
out.
too.
Have you ever talked to him about why he refused to run?
Well, you know, this is only my own view, not his, and I wouldn't attribute it to anybody. I think a number of Democrats who might have run effective races didn't want to be in the White House in the next 4 years because it is not going to be a happy time. Somebody has to do something about the deficit. To do anything, you're going to have to raise taxes or cut some programs which will irritate people. It's not going to be a happy job.
He is one. Sam Nunn, Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey was another. And, of
There's
course,
several.
Governor Mario Cuomo of New York.
Several.
Who has walked away from this race as well. Many of them, as you said, for the same reason. Let's go over to Jeff Greenfield, Jeff, and talk about the future of men who don't run like that. Do you think it hurts their careers generally?
Well, actually, the United States has a version of Groucho Marx's old line. You remember Groucho Marx said he wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have him as a member? We revere politicians who don't run for president. We think they're the cat's meow. The minute they get into the arena, we find terribly, terribly damaging personal or ideological faults about them. And so actually, if a candidate for high national office wanted to care more about prestige than being president, all he would do is constantly refuse to run, and the whole country would be beckoning him into the arena.
Okay, Jeff, Jeff, can I interrupt you for just
Sure,
a second?
please.
Because we only got a couple minutes left here, and we'd like to spend it with Senator Nunn. We can talk to you, if you don't mind, a little later. Senator, you can now hear us. What's the Democratic problem in the South, was my question.
Well, I think the problem here was, and I haven't gotten the results yet, so I haven't given up, but was that George Bush was able to define Mike Dukakis as a liberal, first of all, and second, he was able to define what a liberal was. Until the last couple of weeks when Dukakis really started defining his own philosophy and defining what a classic liberal was as opposed to the image that George Bush was giving him.
So from your point of view, what were the gut issues down there on which people voted?
Well, to be able to get to the issues facing our country here in the South, I think you have to cross a couple of thresholds. One is on national security. Patriotism wraps into that, and the other is on crime. And I think that was where Vice President Bush hit Dukakis very hard. Those of us on the Democratic team believe with a distorted kind of advertising campaign, and Dukakis started fighting back a little late on that.
Senator, if Michael Dukakis were to pull it out this evening, would you be surprised?
Well, I'd be surprised if he pulled it out in the South, but I believe around the country, from what I hear, there are a lot of close races, and the targeted 18 to 20 states are coming in better for Dukakis, from what I hear, than had been anticipated. So this race is not over.
Senator, thank you very much for being patient with us. Sorry we had a technical problem there. Senator Sam Nunn, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who is not up for re-election this year. Though, to remind you, if you're not altogether familiar with the system, 33 Senate seats are being contested tonight. And, of course, everybody in the House of Representatives and 12 governors. When we come back a little later on, we'll be talking to Barry Serafin, who's covering the House and the governor's races for us in Washington. But just very quickly, take a look at the popular board now. 3% of the precincts reporting 58% of the vote for George Bush and 42% now for Michael Dukakis. We will be back. We hope you'll stay with us. It's going to be an exciting evening. I'm Peter Jennings with David Brinkley in New York.
From the ABC News Election Night Command Center, this is the 88 Vote.
Good evening, I'm Peter Jennings, along with my colleague David Brinkley. It is 8 p.m. in the East, and the polls have just closed in 16 more states and in the District of Columbia. So if you'll settle down, we'll tell you what the projections are in all of those states. Let us go to one of the big ones, keystone to the Dukakis campaign, Texas. ABC News projects that the 29 electoral votes in Texas will go to George Bush. In New Jersey, ABC projects that George Bush is the winner there with 16 states, a lot of late campaigning in New Jersey. We also project Tennessee for George Bush with its 11 electoral votes. It's voted Republican in 7 of the last 9. presidential elections. In Oklahoma, we project that George Bush is the winner. Republican votes in all but one in the last 9 presidential elections. In Kansas, we project the winner is George Bush, gone Republican all but once in the last 12 elections. And in Mississippi, we project that George Bush is the winner. Mississippi is his strongest state, and there's somebody who has also added Kansas for me as a projection for George Bush as well. Now let's move on to the state of Mississippi and Missouri. Missouri, we also project for George Bush. That is incorrect at this point. We do not project the state of Missouri for George Bush. We do project Mississippi. It is George Bush's strongest state in the South. And let us, if we can, now go up to Delaware, which has backed the presidential winner in 9 straight elections, the longest current streak in the country. We project Delaware for George Bush. North Dakota, we also project for George Bush at this moment with its 3 electoral votes. And in Massachusetts, Governor Dukakis' home state, where he spent an enormous amount of money in the last few days on Massachusetts radio to make sure that he was not embarrassed in his home state, we project that it has gone for Governor Dukakis. We also project that Maryland is going to go for Michael Dukakis before the end of the evening. That's an interesting state for many reasons, as we will discover as the evening goes on. But like West Virginia, which we projected earlier, it should go indeed to the Democrats. The District of Columbia has never gone for anything else but a Democrat since it began voting for the president, and we project that it goes for Michael Dukakis as well. Let us look at the electoral vote. As of now, George Bush has 207 by our projection, 270 needed to win, and Michael Dukakis has 32. That does not mean it is all over by any means at this particular point in the evening. David Brinkley.
He needs 63 more. Now, I have some projections for the United States Senate, beginning with one which will cause nobody to faint from surprise. It's Lloyd Bentsen in Texas, re-elected. And whether or not he wins the race for vice president, he will hold on to his seat in the Senate. Texans have voted him in again. In Michigan, Donald Regal, the Democrat, defeated James Dunn, the Republican. In Pennsylvania, John Heinz of the Heinz pickle and ketchup family, very wealthy, expected to win a 3rd term easily, and did. In Tennessee, James Sasser, the Democrat, the incumbent, holds on to the seat. In Massachusetts, this is another one that will surprise absolutely nobody. Edward Kennedy, defeated Joseph Malone, elected for a 5th term, I think it is. In Maryland, Paul Sarbanes, the incumbent Democratic senator, elected to a 3rd term easily against one of the 2 black candidates for the Senate this year. In Missouri, John Danforth, he's a Republican. He was expected to win a 3rd term and did. In Mississippi, Trent Lott, the Republican. He replaced John Stennis, who was the oldest member of the Senate, 87 years old, and the most senior senator. He was a Democrat. Trent Lott, a Republican, replaces him. In Maine, George Mitchell, who has eyes on the leadership of the U.S. Senate, a Democrat, re-elected. In Delaware, William Roth, the Republican, who became famous in the days of the Kemp-Roth tax bill, ran for re-election. He's a Republican. He won. North Dakota, Quentin Burdick. He's been there forever. He's 80 years old, won his 5th term. Quentin Burdick in for another term.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the 88th vote. With Sam Donaldson at the Dukakis headquarters in Boston, Britt Hume at the Bush headquarters in Houston, James Wooten and Barry Serafin on Capitol Hill, Lynn Scherr and Jeff Greenfield in New York. And now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Well, from our point of view, that was quite a mouthful, and perhaps from your point of view, quite an earful as we made those projections. As I said, it's 5 minutes after 8 Eastern Standard Time. Polls closed there in 16 more states in the District of Columbia. Let's just take a second and look at the overall map there, because give you a chance to savor what the country is looking like at this point. Just very quickly down on those recent calls, we projected Texas for Bush, New Jersey for Bush, Tennessee for Bush, Oklahoma for Bush, Kansas for Bush. We did not project Missouri for Bush. Missouri has not been projected yet. We did project Mississippi for Bush, Delaware, North Dakota. Massachusetts, his home state, went for Dukakis, as did Maryland and as did the District of Columbia. But that's what our map looks like at this moment. And here is what the popular vote looks like at this moment. It doesn't tell us an awful lot, and it's hard to tell at this point just whether or not there's been an enormous turnout. But with 4% of the precincts reporting, and this is the national popular vote, of course, not the one that counts, but gives us an idea of turnout and everything else before the end of the evening, is over 58% going for George Bush and 42% going for Michael Dukakis. And there are a number of states that are too close to call at this moment, including a couple that closed their polls very early, at least 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Vermont. Missouri, as I just said, is too close to call. Connecticut is too close to call. Illinois is too close to call, key in the Midwest there. Maine, up in the Northeast there, with its 4 electoral votes. George Bush's summer home, too close to call. Michigan, another of the key ones in the Midwest, too close to call. Big Republican battle within the Republican Party earlier in the year. And Pennsylvania is too close to call. And if you're wondering, somebody told me earlier, David, that those colors on that map were restful gray. Hope you feel good about that.
Do you feel rested as a result of
No, I
looking at
feel
them?
like I feel winded after having made all those last calls.
Well, I have a few calls here for governor. And the main reason Washington political leaders and others care about governors, because they're local officers, is that in 1991, after the next census in 1990, they will again carve up the congressional districts in this country under the supervision of the governors. So Democratic governors tend to carve them up in a way to favor the Democrats. So starting in Missouri, Governor Betty Hearns, a Democrat, ran against John Ashcroft, a Republican, and Ashcroft won. Governor of Missouri, John Ashcroft. In Delaware, Michael Castle, Republican, re-elected. And in North Dakota, George Sinner, a Democrat. Peter?
Let's go quickly down. There's an awful lot going to happen in the next hour or so, and we'll bring you up to date sort of in general what's going to happen very shortly. But want to go to Texas quickly, where Britt Hume is standing by with Senator Phil Gramm on what Senator Gramm thinks, Britt, about Texas at this moment. Got it, Britt?
Senator, you were the chairman here in Texas for George Bush, and the question I have for you is, was it worth a try for Michael Dukakis to put a Texas senator on the ticket to try to win this state?
I don't think it was. I think that Michael Dukakis could not carry Texas once people understood where he stood on the issues. I don't think Lloyd Bentsen was ever able to help him in the South, and I think that strategy collapsed.
Well, Bentsen is enormously popular in this state. It appears that he's on his way to being reelected here tonight, probably by a wide margin. Why is it that the people in the state of Texas did not respond to him being on the ticket? You think it'd be a source of some excitement? He, after all, does live here, while George Bush only officially does. Was it really just a question of ideology?
Well, look, Brett, we've had 3 vice presidents in Texas. We've had 1 president. We sure know the difference.
All right. Thank you very much, Senator.
Okay, thanks.
Gentlemen?
Senator Gramm makes a really interesting point. I was down in Texas recently, Dave. They didn't care that George Bush lived in Texas officially or not. He made some of his money there. He had part of his career there. They're looking to have a Texan in the White House. And, of course, they get 2 for 1 down there. And, in fact, Republicans themselves went out and urged Texans to vote twice for Texas. Republicans urged them to vote for Lloyd Bentsen for the Senate and urged them to vote for George Bush. And if George Bush ends up winning the White House, Texas will have the best of both worlds. They also had enormous registration this year. And I think probably the most novel voting experiment in the country, where you could vote for 3 weeks. I think it was called no excuse voting, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's called something like that. In any case, that's what it is. The Texas Republican Party has made a record that must be the envy of every other one in the country. In 20 years, their registration has increased 1,000%. It's gone from about 100,000 to over 1 million in 20 years. And so it's become a Republican state.
345,000 votes, I think, in this particular registration campaign alone. In a minute, we're going to talk to Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who may be Vice President-elect Lloyd Bentsen before the evening. And a little later on, we'll talk to Bill Bradley, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, who, as someone pointed out, wasn't interested in running this year, but was a great public supporter of Michael Dukakis's. All that, the Senate races, the governor's races, House races all over the country, and some fascinating propositions on all of the ballots when we come back.
ABC News coverage of the 88 vote. Brought to you by Kellogg's Product 19. and Chrysler Motors. This is the 88th vote, and ABC News coverage continues. Once again, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
In the great state of California, people voting, and we've just had a call from the Secretary of State in California, the most legitimate call of the evening, saying people are still voting out there. There is still time to vote in California. And of course there is for the presidential race, for that important and expensive Senate race, for a whole host of propositions, as always, on the California ballots. So many propositions on the ballot that in one case they've got express lines where you can go through if you know what you're going to vote for, but it may take you 15 minutes if you want to vote on all of the propositions which are presented to you in California. It is also true, of course, Arizona and Colorado and Nevada, where we'll explain in just a few minutes what is still there you can vote for at this particular time, 8:15 Eastern Standard Time. Joining us in Eastern Standard Time is Senator Bill Bradley. Sorry, David has a projection.
Yeah, I do, and Bill Bradley would be interested in it because it's in New Jersey. We project the winner to be Frank Lautenberg, the Democrat, who is the incumbent. He defeated Pete Dawkins, who's a football star, Army officer, and so on. Frank Lautenberg, the projected winner of the Senate in New Jersey.
Well, let me ask you, Senator Bradley, what does it tell us about the state of campaigning, if anything, because it was about the meanest, nastiest campaign anywhere in the country?
Well, it's great news for Frank Lautenberg and for New Jersey, and I think Frank Lautenberg won because he stood in his record of accomplishment for New Jersey, focused on that in the latter part of the campaign, and pulled it out.
And what you've been watching television tonight and looking at some of the returns, what's the whole country look like to you at the moment?
I think it's still very competitive for Michael Dukakis. I think this could be a longer evening than any of us expect.
And why do you think it's going to be longer than we'd all originally expected?
Well, I think that a lot of the states, he's very competitive. He's only a few points behind. I think it's a little too early to project.
We projected New Jersey, as you know. New Jersey went for a Democrat in the Senate. Why not the state?
Well, New Jersey hasn't gone for a Democrat at the presidential level in over a quarter century. So this is unfortunate, but it's not unpredictable.
So Michael Dukakis is the victim of precedent or the victim of his own campaign there?
I think it's the victim of precedent first, and possibly the very negative and unfair ads about dumping sludge off the Jersey shore might have hurt him too. Because
this was the campaign where New Jerseyites were concerned that the request from Massachusetts to dump waste off your shore, right?
That's correct.
What did you think of that?
I thought it was a little bit of a distorted charge, negative campaigning that characterized the Bush effort throughout.
But didn't the state of Massachusetts actually make a request of New Jersey to dump its sludge off your shores?
Well, the point is the EPA is the active party here.
Which means?
Which means the Reagan administration.
Have you had any second thoughts? Of course, it's too late for this year. Any second thoughts about all of those who urged you to run for president, Senator?
Absolutely not.
I mean, for 4
years. I love
years
representing New Jersey in the United States Senate, and that's where I'll make my contribution.
That's your final word on the subject?
That's my final word.
All right, fine.
See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Bradley. Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey. Just to give you a brief idea of where we are and what we are doing this evening. First of all, we have been projecting races in those states where the polls have closed in the great majority. There are still polls open in many states around the country. Let me give you a small example. In Arizona and Colorado, where the local time is just after 6 o'clock in the evening, you still can vote on a proposition which has been put on the ballot there to make English the official language in the state. In Nevada, where it is a little after 6, 2 hours to cast your vote in a very interesting Senate race there between the incumbent Republican Chick Hecht, who President Reagan went out to Nevada to help the other day, and the Democratic Governor Richard Bryan running against Chick Hecht in the Senate. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, still time to vote in the Senate race there between David Durenberger, who was on the Iran-Contra Committee, and Hubert Humphrey III in Minnesota. And in Colorado, where it is a little after 6, there is still time to vote on a proposition as to whether a state law to prohibit state funding of abortions should be repealed. So that is part of what is going on here tonight beneath that top level of the presidential campaign. The Senate races, 33 of them, all 435 seats in the House, of course, and 12 governors. All of that happening here this evening. And Senator Bradley, I think David put it fairly well. This evening is turning out differently than conventional wisdom.
Well, it's turning out differently from what the polls suggested. The conventional wisdom had nothing to base itself on except polls. And they seemed to suggest that it was going to be a runaway for Bush, which at the moment at least it is not.
We are waiting to talk to Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who we project is going to at least be reelected to his Senate seat, whatever happens to his vice presidential campaign. And we've already projected that Bush has won in the state of Texas. And key to this evening is your LBJ story about Texas, which I'm told you will tell me.
It was the key some years ago. It's not the key now. LBJ was sitting in the White House drinking a beer and scratching his stomach and telling us, some of us, about gathering names to be entered on the voting rolls, and they went to the cemetery to copy some off the tombstones. On one tombstone, it had been there a long time, the moss had grown over it, and it was hard to read the print. And one of them said, well, let's skip this one because I can't read it. And Johnson said, you will not skip it. He has as much right to vote as anybody in this cemetery. So I'm not saying the same thing is happening in Texas today, but it did happen then.
Can I just repeat what we said about Texas earlier, too, that it is very different today, isn't it? They have this no-fault voting. When Senator Bentsen apparently went to cast his vote... No excuse voting. He went to cast his vote and found that 120,000 people in his district had already cast their ballots. Over a 3-week period, people could vote. I don't know that that happens anywhere else in the country.
I don't know either, but what would a program like this do if we didn't have one night on which all of the returns came? What would we do?
Well, I hope people wouldn't feel as badly about this as they appear to have felt about the campaign as a whole. You know, one of the reasons people have been voting, of course, is for someone has been to vote against the other person. And in our exit polls, we ask people that question: did you vote for a candidate or did you vote against one? Lynn sure has some answers. Lynn?
Yes, Peter, you've been talking about negative campaigning. We have information on negative voting. According to our poll, almost half the voters nationwide say they voted to stop another candidate. Let's look at the numbers. As for those people who say they voted to stop another candidate, 49% for Bush, 50% for Dukakis. That means they essentially split the negative vote. And gentlemen, that is not a particularly noble legacy for the next president.
Okay, Lynn, thanks very much. Just to give you a sense of what now must be accomplished by Michael Dukakis, the states that we at this moment reckon are too close to call, which we could, under normal circumstances, call because the polls have closed, are Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Illinois. Now, those polls close there at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. In those states, plus Missouri and Connecticut, we are really seeing the shape of the battle for this evening, the battleground states, if you will, for this evening. For Michael Dukakis to be successful in this come-from-behind drive this evening, he's going to have to win in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, and Connecticut, particularly as he's done so very badly in the South, which is no surprise to him or to the Bush campaign, and because we also project that he has lost in Ohio. We will be back with much more, including Senator Bentsen, after this word from your local stations and local voting.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the 88 vote. Today, America votes in the cities, in the suburbs, all across the nation. Votes being cast to pick a president, 33 senators, 12 governors, to decide thousands of key local issues. It is Election Day 1988. Now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Voting for the 41st President of the United States, to be specific, it is now 8:30 Eastern Standard Time, and the polls have now closed in one more state, and so ABC News is now in a position to project that in the state of Arkansas, George Bush is the winner of the 6 electoral votes there. The deer season opened on Saturday in Arkansas. Bush asked all his supporters to cast absentee ballots before they went hunting, and apparently they did. George Bush is the winner there. Let's look at the overall electoral vote as of 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. That line there in the middle represents the 270 needed in order to win the White House. As of this hour, George Bush has 213 by our projection, and Michael Dukakis has 32. There are a number of states which are too close to call. They are presently, as of 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, half an hour ago, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, Maine, Connecticut, and Missouri and Vermont, where the polls closed about an hour and a half ago, 7 o'clock Eastern time. Those, by the way, are the states in gray. Vermont is still too close to call as well, but we now give Arkansas. And standing by in Texas, waiting to talk to us, is Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who we have projected to win the Senate again, regardless of what happens to him this evening in his vice presidential capacity. Senator, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Can you tell us at first why you think you've done so well for the Senate, but the state is going for George Bush?
Well, it isn't decided yet on the state going for George Bush, and I've heard the projections. But El Paso, the polls are still open out there. And you have an unusual thing that is very difficult for a pollster to tell about, and that is that we have an extraordinary good turnout, a big turnout. And in '82, that confounded the pundits and the political pollsters. And the votes came in late, and Texas had a sweep for the Democrats. That could still happen. So I haven't given up on Texas yet.
Do you seriously believe, sir, with all the evidence you've seen, that the state is going to reverse itself at this point this evening, based on our projection?
Not a matter of reversing itself. It's not over in Texas. You're making a projection. And what I'm saying is, when you have an extraordinary turnout, I've found that the pollsters can't anticipate that and determine how they will go. And as a result of that, it's still possible that Texas could go Democratic. I saw that happen in '82.
David.
Senator, as one who's been listening to you for a long time, you sound as if you've been running a political campaign and worn out your vocal cords. Is that right?
David, you're right on that. They're a little raspy now.
Well, you'll recover, sir.
Senator, can I ask you this? It does, the Republicans mounted this very effective, or seemingly effective, campaign to get two for the price of one, so to speak, in Texas, you and George Bush. Do you think they've been effective to some degree?
Well, I think it's been a pretty smart political move on their part, and I suppose they picked up a few. But overall, I doubt it's many. And I think in this situation, Mike Dukakis has been able to get his message across, particularly in the last 3 or 4 weeks, appealing to working men and women of American middle income. And there still can be where it pulls it off, and I'm looking at states, a number of big states. Pennsylvania could go either way. We show that we've got about a 2-point lead. Illinois, we show a pretty good lead. New York, we feel, is ours. Michigan is a toss-up, really. So I think it may be a long night yet. We look at the West Coast and states out there that we think are going to be ours: California, Oregon, Washington, and I think that we'll be around for a while tonight.
Senator Bentsen, can I just ask you one last question? I don't by any means pretend to be an expert in your state, but down there about a week or so ago, I found a lot of people felt that Lloyd Bentsen had the right touch in Texas, but that Michael Dukakis did not. And as you answer this, I'd like to show you the popular vote again in your state, at least as it's being tallied now. What do you think?
Well, they did a job on Mike Dukakis with the negative ads, and they distorted his record and did so to a remarkable degree. And that was difficult to overcome. I wasn't worked over like that. They didn't do that type of thing to me, character assassination. I had a man running against me, for the Senate that tried to work me over. But overall, I've been pretty much unscathed.
Well, Senator Bentsen, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Texas tonight. And as you say, it may well indeed be a longer evening than some people had anticipated.
Well, they all hate Bush's commercials, don't they? Just hate them. One of the Dukakis people said of the convicts marching into prison and out again, he said it was unscrupulous, disgraceful, dishonest, destructive, and effective. Does that tell you something about the future of American politics?
Well, I can tell you about Texas at the moment, David. All over Texas, there were these enormous billboards beside the highway saying Mike Dukakis is going to take your guns away. Now, Mike Dukakis had no intention of doing that, but it took him an inordinately long time in Texas to respond to that early campaign against him down there, and I think that Senator Bentsen has made it clear that they really did work him over down there.
Well, they did.
Joining us now on the other side of the table is ABC's George Will. We've been talking a little bit about the South off camera here with you. How does it look to you at the moment? Do you think Michael Dukakis can pull it off?
It looks very familiar, Peter. I'm looking at our scoreboard up there, and every state of the old Confederacy has turned red for George Bush so far, except Louisiana, which we've not called yet. Peter, there are 11 states in the old Confederacy. They have between them today 138 electoral votes. That's more than half the total needed to win the White House. In 5 recent elections, that is beginning in 68, going up through 88, not counting 76 when Carter ran for the first time. In 5 recent elections, a total potential yield, 5 times 11, of 55 states. If Louisiana goes against Dukakis tonight, the Democratic record in these 5 elections will be 2 wins and 53 losses. Now, if you start the campaign that much in the hole, 138 electoral votes, you're like a baseball pitcher who says, I can win, but I have to throw every pitch within 2 inches of the outside corner. I can't make a single mistake. And no one can do that. Now, we just talked to Lloyd Bentsen, who is a marvelous candidate. Everyone agrees he gets very good reviews. But there are going to be people tonight who say, well, you were never going to carry Texas anyway. You can't win in the South. Should have gone to Ohio for John Glenn.
George, before we continue talking about the South, let me say that we are now in a position to project the state of Connecticut, where George Bush went to school, among other things. We projected for George Bush. It was won by Ronald Reagan with an enormous majority in 1984, and it goes to George Bush this year. It's the state where he grew up and went to school. His father was the U.S. Senator in Connecticut. And 1968, George Will has been speaking about dates, was the last time a Democrat carried Connecticut, and that was Hubert Humphrey. You talked about Lloyd Bentsen and the South there. The Bush campaign said that Dukakis had made a fatal mistake by picking Dukakis to win Texas and the South. We have the wonderful benefit of hindsight on election night. What do you think?
Well, that's right. I mean, you can sympathize with what Dukakis thought at the convention. I have to look bold. I can't be seen to be conceding the South. So he went with Bentsen. Still, people will say the minute they did that, the Republicans began to concentrate like fury on the state of Ohio. And as long as they could carry Ohio, again, that's just one of the things that Dukakis absolutely had to take. There were an enormous number of states giving up, as I say, to begin with, 138 electoral votes down south. Everything became necessary for Dukakis. Almost nothing was indispensable to George Bush.
Great, George. Thanks very much. Look forward to talking to you later in the evening. David, thought?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay, then we'll go in, come back in just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
I'm Peter Jennings in New York with David Brinkley and the rest of our election staff. Hope you'll stay with us.
Once again, from the ABC News Election Night Command Center in New York, the 88 vote continues with Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Just want to clarify an impression that I may have inadvertently given. About 15 or 20 minutes ago, I'm reminded, David, I said that defying conventional wisdom, the presidential campaign is not a runaway this evening. At the moment, it really isn't either. George Bush has not. Let's look at the electoral board. George Bush has not yet put together enough electoral votes to win the presidency, but as George Will has just pointed out, and is very obvious from that map, with the South going as it did, George Bush has 221 electoral votes at this moment, and Michael Dukakis has 32. George Bush is still some distance away, and why I say that it is not a runaway is because there were a great many people throughout the country using the famous conventional wisdom and using the polls up until the last couple of days who believed that this was going to be something of a blowout for George Bush. It may turn out to be that way before the evening is over. Nonetheless, at this moment, there are some states which are simply too close to call, and they are Pennsylvania and Michigan, Illinois, and Maine. We've just projected Connecticut for George Bush, Missouri, and Vermont. And Lloyd Bentsen may have said that things would change in Texas based on that new registration. We are presently projecting Texas for George Bush.
You know, it's interesting. We just saw Lloyd Bentsen and have seen a good deal of him, the Democratic candidate for vice president. But what about the Republican, Dan Quayle? Where is he? We haven't seen him. So I have a report to tell you where he is and why you have not seen him. They have been sending him to these places: Napoleon, Ohio, Kankakee, Illinois, Appleton, Wisconsin, Van Wert, Ohio, and Noonan, Georgia. That's where they've been sending Quayle, and in each of these places he's been talking to high school students not old enough to vote. So,
well, I could also tell you what he did today. Well, today he went back to his hometown dentist to get his teeth cleaned. And he says he's done that before on Election Day, and that has proved to be good luck for him. He then visited his 97-year-old grandmother, Martha Pulliam, in Franklin, Indiana, before flying back to Washington, D.C., where I hope we're going to have a chance to talk to him later this evening at the Republican National Headquarters in Washington. Speaking of candidates, a man who at one point would have liked very much to have been the presidential candidate now joins us, Senator Al Gore of Tennessee. Again, I can't be absolutely certain where you are, Senator Gore, and I apologize.
I'm in Nashville.
Thank you very much for joining us from Nashville and taking the time, and tell us what's happening to the party in the South.
Well, here in Nashville, we're about to celebrate a tremendous landslide victory for Jim Sasser, who's being reelected to the United States Senate. We're still waiting on the returns in the presidential race, and of course the projections here in Tennessee are not that great from our standpoint, but the word has not come in officially, and we still have hope and we still have fight left in us, and that's true of Democrats and Dukakis Bentsen partisans all over the country.
Senator, we have heard several Democrats say that Dukakis has had a problem with Bush defining him rather than he defining himself. Why was that allowed to happen? You have any idea? You wouldn't have done that, would you?
Well, Mike Dukakis himself said that in retrospect he probably waited way too long after the convention to get out on the offensive and respond to some of the attacks that were forthcoming. And that's true not only because it was an effective negative attack, but also because of the factor you mentioned. He was defined by those negative attacks, and he himself has acknowledged that mistake. I think very impressively in the last few weeks of the campaign, you saw him, heard him find his voice and come on very strong, breathing fire into his campaign and close the gap tremendously.
Did you find him defining himself to the satisfaction of those of you in the South, Senator?
Well, I think what you saw with the naming of Lloyd Bentsen as his running mate, the naming of Sam Nunn as one of his co-chairs, a very strong and responsible platform adopted in Atlanta, a determined effort by Mike Dukakis to run in the centrist traditions of the Democratic Party. Now, that probably was a lot more apparent after the nomination was locked up in the late spring, but I think it brought a lot of people to his side. It was largely responsible for the unprecedented unity that we've seen in this race on the part of Democratic officials all over the country.
Okay, Senator, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time. Just to remind people that we have already projected that Jim Sasser is going to be returned as the Democratic senator from the state of Tennessee, which of course is also Senator Gore's. He's not up until 1990. Right. Yeah.
It was a convenient time for him to run for president this year.
Tennessee's produced some very interesting politicians. Yes. Senator Gore, Howard Baker, Jim Sasser,
among others.
President Polk. Who else?
Well, it produced a lot of Republicans during the Civil War. The east end of Tennessee was and still is Republican, and it sided with the North during the Civil War. So some remnants of that tradition still continue.
Well, speaking of Republicans, let's go to Washington, where Carol Simpson is standing by at Republican National Headquarters there, in what is advertised, Carol, as a good mood. Am I right?
Peter, I can scarcely hear you with all of Lionel Hampton's music and very thousands of Republican Party faithful here. We are in the midst of a big GOP victory party. Everybody who is anybody and a Republican and still in Washington is here. There was talk that President Reagan might drop by, but we don't think he will now. Dan Quayle, the vice presidential hopeful, is upstairs in the 8th floor watching the returns with his family and close friends. He's expected to come down here sometime after George Bush makes an appearance in Houston. I must tell you that as festive as this crowd is, I have had sources tell me and confide to me that they are a little bit surprised that things were as tight as they have turned out to be. They're surprised at some of the big states that are still in contention. But they're still confident that this is going to be a Bush-Quayle victory party tonight. They just thought they'd be celebrating it a little sooner than they are now.
Okay, Carol, thanks very much. We'll be coming back to you throughout the evening. The last time we went up to Boston, to Dukakis headquarters, they were telling us up there that there was a way which they could put together a model tonight which would enable Dukakis to approach the 270 electoral votes he needed. Let's go there now to Sam Donaldson. Sam, what do they think now?
Well, Peter, they still have a scenario that concedes to George Bush all of those states on our map that are in red now, the Bush color, for the purpose of the scenario, which would still allow Dukakis to win. Let me tell you what it looks like. They say they're going to take Massachusetts, Rhode Island, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Iowa, West Virginia, New York, Washington, and Minnesota. That's 94 electoral votes. Then they have 14 states that they consider toss-ups. They're the ones that you and David have been talking about. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maryland, already now in the Dukakis camp. Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, Montana, Nevada, Colorado, California, and others. They must take all of those electoral votes, 181, except for 5. Now you can give them one state there, one of the very small states, and they could still squeak over the top. But as you and George Will and others have pointed out, there is no margin for error here. So they could still do it, theoretically. But the very next one of those toss-up states that we project for Bush, if those projections hold up, will mean Dukakis is doomed.
Sam, we're going to, well, don't go away for a second. We're going to put our map up now to reflect what it looks like at the moment. But as we look at it, talk again to us, if you will, about the mood of the Dukakis campaign. You've been with the campaign from the beginning. It clearly has changed in the last couple of weeks. What changed it? I mean, they really seem to be not in bad shape at all this evening.
Well, I don't know what makes people get their act together. I can't tell you, except they finally got their act together. It was at one of their low points, Peter. Remember the second debate in California? Everybody looked at that debate and said, well, Dukakis blew his last best chance because he wasn't scrappy there. He told me later that he was trying to be too nice. Remember, everyone had advised him to, well, be more personable, Dukakis. Everybody thinks you're a cold fish. And so he didn't use a lot of his best lines that people are prepared for him. But right after that, for some reason, they decided, all right, let's go now and see if we can win this election. So they're still scrappy. But tonight, I got to tell you, if Dukakis loses, the poignancy of the postmortems, and I think the bitterness and harshness in some senses of the recriminations are going to be very, very strong. Because if you get blown out, you say, all right, there's nothing I could have done. I was blown away. But if you lose by a squeaker in the Electoral College, then, of course, you're going to say, if I'd only done this, or if you'd only done that. So let's wait.
Okay,
gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Sam. Indeed, we will wait, because we'll make the point again. We're not going to call a race in any state where the majority of the polls have not closed. We're going to call, based on our exit polling information, the history of the state in some cases. As we said earlier in the evening, Utah hasn't gone Democrat since heavens knows when. But we're not going to call races in those states where the polls have not closed. And in California, for example, where there is often a complaint that the television networks affect the voting, I must tell you, David, after having visited California a couple times in the last couple of weeks, they're almost as interested out there in the insurance, the car insurance propositions on the ballot as they are in the presidential race. At least that was my impression.
Well, insurance, automobile insurance, certainly will cost them money. The new president may do so. And you know, one of the Dukakis people, what Sam was just saying, one of the Dukakis people put it, I thought, rather nicely. Too nice, too long. What they think Dukakis was. Stayed too long being a nice guy, while Bush was cutting him up.
We are going to go away for a while now, but we'll be back in the next hour with all sorts of interesting projections in this race. I must tell you, there is at least a sort of democratic instinct at a variety of places out there tonight. 7 states have voted for George Bush, but have voted for a Democratic senator or a governor. Indiana, Virginia, Ohio, New Jersey, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. We'll have much, much more in the next hour. Here's your local voting pattern.
From the ABC News Election Night Command Center, this is the 88 Vote.
Hello again, I'm Peter Jennings along with David Brinkley. It is now 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and the polls have just closed in 11 more states, and so ABC News is now in a position to make some more projections on the presidential race. In New York, ABC News projects that Michael Dukakis has won the 36 electoral votes. There was some question not long ago in the campaign as to whether he would hold it, but he did, and those 36 electoral votes represent 13% of the total needed to win. We project that Dukakis wins in the state of Minnesota, the only state that Walter Mondale carried in 1984. Dukakis started strong there and stayed strong. In Rhode Island, normally a Democratic state, we project that Michael Dukakis gets the 4 electoral votes there. And now we go back down to the south, to Louisiana, where George Bush was last a visitor during the Republican convention. He made a good impression, obviously. He gets the 10 electoral votes in Louisiana. In Arizona, as we begin to move west, George Bush, we project, is the winner in a state that hasn't voted for a Democrat since Harry Truman in 1948. In Nebraska, we project that George Bush is in the winner there. Dukakis got in trouble there when the former governor, was asked if he could recommend Dukakis as a fellow candidate, and he said basically no. In Wyoming, we predict that George Bush is the winner, the home of Old Faithful, troubled summer. usually an easy state for Republican candidates, and proves to be again this evening. Let us now take a look at the electoral vote as it now stands. George Bush is getting a good deal closer. The 270 needed to win, we project that he has 246 based on what he has won so far, and Michael Dukakis has 82 by our projection. And just before we move on to some of the other races, the states which are presently, we reckon, too close to call are Wisconsin, Colorado, New Mexico, and South Dakota. That is as of this hour, where the polls have just closed. The other states still too close to call are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, Maine, Missouri, and Vermont. And that's the too close to call board all across the country in those places where the polls have now closed. David.
Peter, I have some projections for the United States Senate, beginning with one which is probably a great surprise to most people. It is that Lowell Weicker, the Republican senator from Connecticut, has been defeated by Joseph Lieberman, the Democrat. He, incidentally, was endorsed by another Connecticut resident named William Buckley. Joseph Lieberman, the winner in Connecticut. In New York, this is not much of a surprise. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Democratic senator, has been reelected to a third term, defeating Robert McMillan. They had trouble finding anyone to vote against him. In Wisconsin, Herbert Cole, the owner of a basketball team and quite wealthy, came in to replace the retiring William Proxmire, who spent about $100 on a campaign. He spent quite a lot trying to buy the election, they said, but whatever happened, he won. In Minnesota, David Durenberger, the Republican, defeated Hubert Humphrey III. Hubert Humphrey III said he knew he could not fill his father's shoes, but he certainly could fill David Durenberger's. But he failed to take the shoes. Durenberger won. In Arizona, Dennis DeConcini, a Democrat, won again. There was never much doubt about it. He's very popular there. Defeated Keith DeGreen, the Republican. In Rhode Island, or the Senate, John Chafee, the Republican, re-elected. In Nebraska, Robert Kerry, the Democrat won, defeating David Carnes, the incumbent Republican. In New Mexico for the Senate, Jeff Bingaman, the incumbent Democrat, defeated Bill Valentine, the Republican.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the 88 vote. With Sam Donaldson at the Dukakis headquarters in Boston, Britt Hume at the Bush headquarters in Houston, James Wooten and Barry Serafin on Capitol Hill, Lynn Scher and Jeff Greenfield in New York. And now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
I want to unfumble a story, David. If I sit beside you for enough years, I'll get them right. Robert Carey in Nebraska, the former governor, decorated war hero from Vietnam, amputee, very popular in the state, is the one who was asked at a meeting of the Rotary in Omaha whether or not there was any other reason to vote for Michael Dukakis other than the fact that he was on the top of the ticket. And he said no in public, which did not help Governor Dukakis in the state of Nebraska. The Senate is beginning to take a reasonably anticipated shape, except for that loss of Lowell Weicker in Connecticut. The GOP has now gained in Mississippi with Trent Lott, a former congressman, is now going to go to the Senate for Mississippi. The Democrats have gained in Virginia, where Chuck Robb has taken the seat from Paul Tribble, who was a Republican who retired. Some people said rather than run against Chuck Robb, Lyndon Johnson's son-in-law. And in Connecticut, where, as David has just said a moment ago, Lowell Weicker, probably, I guess, David, the most liberal Republican senator of all, has gone down to defeat to the state attorney general. So as of now, the Democrats are a net gain of 1.
Weicker was so liberal that some of the Republicans wondered why he was in their party. They didn't like him much.
Well, he was the one who at the convention argued for the inclusion of platforms on AIDS, for example, which the Republican Party never did put in the platform, despite his best efforts.
Paid for it.
Exactly, among other things. We are going to talk in just a moment to the Reverend Jesse Jackson. But before we do that, we want to look at the black vote as we know it so far across the country this evening. There has been a lot of talk throughout this campaign as to whether or not blacks would really turn out for Michael Dukakis. He did not campaign in the most visible way in many black communities across the country. The person who tells us how blacks have voted and why is Lynn Sher. Lynn?
Peter, Mike Dukakis is doing extremely well among black voters, and you can see it particularly in the state of Illinois. When you take a look at the black vote in the state of Illinois, you see that Dukakis is getting 95% to Bush's 4%. Now, keep looking at that number while I tell you that Fritz Mondale, Walter Mondale in 1984, got 86% of the black voters. So that is a really big change for Mike Dukakis. It is also the case that Dukakis is doing quite well with black voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and that may be one of the reasons why those states are still too close to call. There's obviously a lot going on in those states. Gentlemen?
Okay, Lynn, thanks very much. We want to go now to Chicago, where the Reverend Jesse Jackson is standing by, a man who has played an enormous role in this entire presidential year. Mr. Jackson, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Yes, sir.
What does it look like to you? That's the most obvious question.
Well, certainly at this point, at the very top of the ticket, it is not looking good, but certainly Mike Dukakis has run a gallant race with integrity. And if it holds up this way, George Bush, of course, is to be respected, and all of us are to reach out for some common ground agenda. He did say in one dimension of his campaign of a kinder and gentler nature. And I hope people will get campaign behind us and look at that kinder, gentler agenda as it relates to health care and daycare and workers and family farmers.
Mr. Jackson,
in
all
all
the
years...
years...
campaign, but a good campaign.
Sorry, I was just going to interrupt to say that in all the years I've listened to you, I've never heard you lose your voice to this extent. Is that the result of this last-minute flurry of campaigning?
Well, not last minute. I've campaigned extensively and exhaustively because I believe that the Dukakis-Benson priorities was good for all Americans, as they have stood for economic rights for women and prenatal care for everybody. The kind of agenda that appears everybody's moving toward now, I thought it was worth putting forth my best efforts.
Mr. Jackson, you were saying the other day that if Dukakis loses, and we don't know that yet, if Dukakis loses, the 1992 campaign would begin tomorrow, Wednesday. The implication being, I don't want to be sure if we have you quoted correctly, implication being that the campaign beginning tomorrow would be yours. Is that right?
No, that's not the right implication. The fact is, the next quadrennial political season begins tomorrow. What does it include? It includes coalescing our leadership to protect our gains as a party and to count up our losses. It means putting forth a legislative agenda in January that will protect the common good of the American people, from farmers to workers. It means big city elections in 1989 and census count in 1990 and reapportionment in 1991. My point was people can't just vote and go home. The process of political involvement is an ongoing process. It's much too early, premature and downright immature to be talking about 1992 politics on this night.
Mr. Jackson, I want to ask you one last question, and you've been very diplomatic about Mr. Dukakis, but you said just the other day that the Dukakis campaign had ignored its base and then tried to land without crash landing. What did you mean?
Well, it seems to me that in these latter days, we saw movement. Movement came, it seems to me, for three basic reasons. One, Mr. Dukakis left those network camera or 30-second blurbs and began to let America see his highest, his best, and truest self in the talk shows. Secondly, basic Democratic leaders, governors, congresspeople, and senators stopped analyzing the ticket and started working for the ticket. And thirdly, began to focus more on urban America. That's our base vote. Urban America is multicultural, and for that base, it deserves three basic things: attention, sunshine, and water. And the more water he gave it, the more it flourished. And in those states right now where we're doing very well, because those are states like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, he visited lately, and he made great impressions upon those communities.
Mr. Jackson, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this evening.
Thank you.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, who earlier in this campaign, David, and early in the primary and caucus season, some people thought was the only man really talking to the issues.
There are a great many who thought that. He did talk issues, and rather specifically. The others generally have not. They've had a lot of nice phrases that sounded good, but when you analyze them, didn't mean much.
I must confess I'm a little interested, and this is a personal reaction, surprised to what Lynn is saying about black turnout for Dukakis. Willie Brown, who's the most senior black official in the state of California, said that the only person who campaigned actively for the black vote was Jesse Jackson. and that Dukakis and none of the others had gone for it, and that was stupid. And he said that there wasn't the black enthusiasm there for Governor Dukakis, and Lynn is telling us that in the exit polls it appears to be there. Bearing in mind, of course, that the black vote, like the Hispanic vote, like any powerful minority vote, is only really effective when an election is close. And let us take a look at how close it appears to be based on our projection, with a majority of the polls either having closed in all of the states in which we have projected a race. It may be, as some people have pointed out to us on the telephone, that in a state, one or two, or even a small handful of precincts have remained open. But we are not calling races in any state where the majority of the polls have not closed. And take a quick look up here at the popular vote here, with 16% of the precincts reporting in from around the country. We estimate now that George Bush will have 56% and Michael Dukakis will have 44% as of now. We will be back with more right after these messages.
ABC News coverage of the 88 vote. Brought to you by Plymouth and Merrill Lynch. This is the 88 vote, and ABC News election night coverage continues. Once again, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Good evening again. It is 9:15 Eastern Standard Time, and we now make a projection in a state which it took us some time to come to a conclusion about. ABC News now projects that in Maine, George Bush is the winner. That state was too close to call for some time. That's where George Bush's summer home is, up at Kennebunkport. The question is, if he wins the presidency tonight, will it become the summer White House? The slogan up there has been since the mid-1860s, David, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. I don't know why, quite frankly, it took so long to resolve things up there in Maine tonight. The rest of New England settled fairly quickly.
I don't know. I thought it would go for Bush very quickly, because he doesn't live there. He says he lives in Texas, though there's some debate about that. But he has a big house in Maine, Kennebunkport, where on holidays and other times in the summer, the whole family gathers and they have a good time there. It means something to Maine, I think, to have a summer White House.
Speaking
apparently it didn't mean a whole lot, because it took a long time to get around to voting for him.
Took a while to get there. Speaking of Republicans, you may have noticed, if you've been with us for some time, that we have been talking to quite a number of Democrats, but we haven't yet talked to any Republicans. It has not been for lack of trying. Republicans at this point, 2 hours and 15 minutes after our coverage began, have been reluctant to come out and talk. I don't know if that's the word that's gone out through the Republican ranks this evening, or whether we're an exception. I can tell you that we talked to Dan Quayle's spokesman, David Prosperi, a while ago, and he said there will be no interviews with Senator Quayle this evening. There will be no photo opportunity with Senator Quayle. He's not even going to be seen watching the election returns, because, in Senator Quayle's words, this is George Bush's night. Well, there's a great deal happening tonight, of course. The Senate, a third of the Senate is up, all of the House races, and we have not yet checked in on the House races, so let us do that by going to Washington and ABC's Barry Serafin. Barry?
Peter, I'm in the House Ways and Means Committee hearing room, and this is a room where they do things that actually affect your life, taxes and Social Security and Medicare. And the guessing is, when this election is over with, most of these chairs are going to be filled by most of the same people, and that is expected to be true throughout the House. Nearly all the members of the House, 408 of them, are running for re-election. 2 years ago, 98% of incumbents were re-elected, and that's not a new pattern. Over the past 40 years, the average re-election rate has been 92%. Incumbents simply have too much of an advantage in name familiarity and staff and free mailing, and most of all in money. Now, having said all that, there may be a few incumbents in trouble tonight, and probably the man at the top of the list, at least that's what the guessing is Pat Swindle. He's the Republican congressman in Georgia's 4th district. That's the Atlanta suburbs. As you see, we're just getting some preliminary returns in, only 1% of the precincts, but Swindle is behind at this point. You'll remember, Pat Swindle is the congressman who was indicted for lying to a grand jury about considering a loan financed with laundered drug money, and his troubles have now been compounded. The Justice Department is now investigating him for sending out some campaign literature talking about a polygraph test he took. One other race we might point out to you, simply because it's another incumbent, but it's also a case where we might be looking for some ticket splitting, is in Indiana's 3rd district. John Hyler is the Republican incumbent out there, and as you see, he's now trailing his Democratic challenger, Thomas Ward. Now, these two men met 2 years ago, and this is a rematch with some real history to it. Tom Ward, the Democrat, lost by just 47 votes last time they met, and it took 2 months to count those votes. I'm sure whatever happens, both of them hope that won't be the case this time. Gentlemen?
Okay, Barry, thanks very much. David?
Peter, you were saying that Dan Quayle said he would have no statement tonight, no pictures tonight, no nothing tonight, because he didn't want to upstage George Bush at the head of the ticket. He's learning to be the vice president very quickly, playing second fiddle.
We have a couple of projections to make here. We project now that the state of Missouri is going to go for George Bush, another Midwestern bellwether that had voted Republican 4 out of the last 5 elections, and we now project that Missouri is going to Bush. And we are going to make a change in Maryland. We had earlier projected that Maryland was going to go for Michael Dukakis, and we now project that it is going to go for George Bush. So as you look at the map there, let us have a look at the total electoral votes as they actually change up there at the moment. And it hasn't caught up at the moment, but George Bush has at the moment, David, more than 250, and I don't think Michael Dukakis has more than 78. Well, according to our calculations, at 20 minutes after 9 Eastern Standard Time, based on the projections in the states where the polls have closed, George Bush has the electoral votes required to be the next president of the United States.
We were hearing from them a minute ago that Maine did it for them, put them over. So 271, that's one more than needed. He can go home.
Well, they certainly feel. Can we go down to Houston for a moment, folks, and talk very briefly to Britt Hume, because, in fact, that was the word we got up from there. Britt Hume covers the Bush campaign for us. Britt, the old phrase, as Maine goes, so goes the nation, suddenly turned the Bush people on down there, right?
Well, the Bush people had an electoral strategy that was built on the South, the Mountain West, a couple of the wheat states, New Jersey and Ohio. Now, with Colorado hanging fire, it was impossible to project that. So the situation changed when we showed Connecticut for Bush. That was a state they weren't counting on. And then Maine, and it meant that all they needed was the remaining states in the Mountain West, excluding Colorado. Now your projections in Missouri and Maryland make it beyond question.
Okay, thank Britt Hume very much. We're going to go away now so that you can concentrate on your local races around the country. But as of now, we project that George Bush has 271 electoral votes, and that's what it takes. We'll be back on the half hour.
ABC News coverage of the 88 vote continues. Once again, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Take a quick look at the popular vote here with 23% of the precincts reporting in from around the country. It's hard to tell how considerable the turnout has been, but there it is, 23%, 55% of the vote going for George Bush, 11 million votes been tabulated, and 45% for Michael Dukakis. 9 of them have been tabulated as well. We're going to talk to Senator Barry Goldwater in just a minute. David, you know, I said just before we went away the last time that there was an enormous number of propositions on the ballot in California. It says an enormous amount, doesn't it, about the sort of citizen participation in democracy, how there are propositions on ballot almost every state in the country.
Well, it's pretty much started in California, to the best of my knowledge. At least it became a big deal in California before it did anywhere else.
Proposition 13.
It's a kind, yeah, that was one example of it. It's a kind of democratic populism that they have developed to a greater degree than any other state. And every election now in California has some kind of proposition about something. And some, once they are voted by the public and approved, sometimes are found unconstitutional in the courts. But that's only a small percentage. It's just a part of the system there.
And to some extent, you know, they really do. I'm just looking through them here. They do reflect, you know, what have been in some respects the hot issues of the campaign or the times. There are very tough anti-smoking measures on the ballot in Oregon and California. Crimes, this question of shutting down furloughs, which was an issue in the campaign, eliminating parole for people on the ballot in Oregon, Florida, and Michigan. South Dakota, deregulation. A lot of gun control. Maryland has a very tough gun control law to ban the Saturday night specials if it finally passes.
They're going to have a little board to decide what guns can be sold and which ones cannot. I gather the cheap, flimsy ones cannot, but I don't quite understand why. I mean, would you rather be shot by an expensive gun or a cheap gun? I don't understand that.
You were talking earlier about a dirty campaign and a negative campaign. Nobody better really to talk about campaigns than Senator Barry Goldwater, who's consented to join us tonight from Scottsdale, Arizona. Senator, I remember sitting at the end of your driveway in 1964, and your wife very kindly brought chocolate cake down to young reporters sitting at the end of the driveway. Thank you for coming out.
It's a pleasure to have you. He is one of the great young figures in the Republican Party.
I want to make sure he can hear us. Can you hear us, Senator Goldwater?
I can hear you now. I had to turn it up a bit.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm going to repeat my compliment, if I may. I was complimenting your wonderful wife, who so well treated young reporters in your 64 campaign as we stood in the cold at the end of your driveway. David, you got this.
I also wanted to be sure he heard me describe him as one of the great young figures in the Republican Party. He introduced, in the modern sense, introduced conservatism to America, didn't you?
Well, I tried. It didn't take much introduction. Conservatism is the oldest philosophy known to man, and most people believe in it.
But it had disappeared in this country during the New Deal, and when you brought it back in '64, a number of otherwise thoughtful people found it shocking and unintelligible. It didn't work the first time. It's worked since, hasn't it?
Well, there comes times in the American history when people don't understand what's going on. 64 was one of those times, although that isn't the reason I lost. The country wasn't ready for 3 presidents in 2.5 years. That's the whole thing.
Senator, I was going to say, Senator, you were victims of one of the earliest negative television campaigns. Taking that as a baseline of experience, what did you think of this year?
Well, I didn't think either one of them talked much about the issues. I wouldn't call it a particularly dirty campaign, although I thought the Atlanta convention that nominated Dukakis was about the dirtiest thing I ever listened to. It was funny, just funnier than hell. I'd like to listen to that Texas girl anytime she wants to talk, but you start a campaign like that, it's going to wind up dirty.
Well, yours was a little rough. They called you a warmonger. And they had a commercial about an exploding atomic bomb. A little girl picking daisies.
Oh, that little girl picking daisies. That's the thing that started all this dirty campaigning. And I hope to God we can do away with it. There's no place in this country for negative or dirty campaigning. And we should stop it now before it gets worse.
Do you think there's any chance of that, Senator?
I do. I think if we get the right people running and talk turkey to them, that we can convince them that you can talk to the issues, you can talk about yourself, and you don't have to be nasty to each other. I thought that both Dukakis and Bush had chances to be very decent to each other. They weren't always decent, but you can't blame them. What the hell? You at one point said in the campaign to Senator Quayle that he should go tell George Bush to talk about the issues. You still
That's
feel?
right.
You still feel that he didn't do it?
Let's put it this way. George Bush started out with a campaign against Dukakis to paint him as a liberal. And that's all he did. Just talk about liberal, 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 and made it a very dirty word, which is all right with me.
Well, Dukakis later came around to saying, yes, I am a liberal, after avoiding the subject for quite a long time. Was that surprising to you?
Well, no, it wasn't surprising. He must be an honest man. I don't know him. Sounds like an honest guy, a nice fellow. But if you're a liberal, you're a liberal. And I'm a conservative, and I'm a conservative.
I have a final question.
There are some certain facts still left, aren't there, Peter?
I just have a final question. How are you feeling, Senator? A lot of people in the country will be keen to know.
Well, I never felt better in my life. I got a bad leg, but I've had 2 bad legs as long as I quit playing football or riding horseback. And I'm off to the hustings tomorrow and going to Taiwan.
Oh, gracious.
What for, Senator?
Oh, I used to fly with those fellas in World War II, and I go back there about every year or two just to
sit down, have a few drinks, and tell lies about flying. There's no worse liars than pilots.
That may be politicians when they're off duty, or journalists.
No, a pilot and a politician you can't beat.
Senator Goldwater, thank you very much for coming out there this evening. David Brinkley, I know, talked you into coming out this evening, and we very much appreciate you coming.
Well,
Senator, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, I must also tell you we're now in a position to project another state. In the state of Wisconsin, which people keep shouting in my ear, we are now able to project that Dukakis is the winner in the state of Wisconsin with electoral votes. It was a real contest there for a while, but Dukakis has been ahead at the beginning, and he remains ahead at the end. And Dukakis ahead in the state of Wisconsin. In fact, by our estimation, we now project that Dukakis will win the state of Wisconsin.
Gives him 83 electoral votes.
Yeah. Go back a little bit to what Senator Goldwater was talking about dirty campaign. He said that this was dirty. Of course, George Washington started it in some respects, or at least during George Washington's day. It's been dirty a lot of times, hasn't it?
Well, it was more than dirty. It was vicious in the early days of this country, in the earlier political campaigns. The language used, you really could not use it today in public. Couldn't say what
I've looked up some of it, I must tell you, that in Washington, he was remembered to be a dolt, a thief, and a philanderer. Theodore Roosevelt was called a drunkard and a drug fiend. Lincoln was criticized as being illegitimate. Can you remember some others? Grover Cleveland? What was the famous campaign slogan about Grover Cleveland?
Let's see. How did it go? Where's your pa? Going to the White House? Ha, ha, ha. Because he was accused, I think rightly, of having a child born out of wedlock. And that little doggerel became a part of the campaign.
There's more, at least on my brief list that I put together. Andrew Jackson had a rough campaign. His mother was called a prostitute. And his father was identified as a mulatto, though I'm not sure why that would have been a particular insult then. Of course, not today. Here are some early unofficial returns, I am told, on propositions. In the state of Maryland, the NRA, you may be interested to know, launched about a $4 million campaign in the state of Maryland against the proposition which would ban the Saturday night specials there. The NRA outspent the defenders of the gun ban by more than 12 to 1. One of the great spokesmen on the gun ban there was Sarah Brady, the wife of Jim Brady, President Reagan's press secretary, who was shot, as you recall.
So what's the figure there?
66% have rejected the measure to ban Saturday night specials. That, as I said, is an early return in Maryland. In Colorado, the proposition to make English an official language is winning 60%. There's a proposition in Colorado. I think there's one in Nevada. I may get it wrong. And Florida. They are widely regarded by their opponents to be quite racist. And in Florida, interestingly enough, the Justice Department finally came along and said, if you want to have a proposition on making English the official language, you have to put it on the ballot in Spanish. Colorado.
Colorado also has a proposition saying that state and local taxes may not be raised unless they're approved in a public vote.
Don't have anything on that at the moment, but we do have the initiative to prohibit state funding of abortion in Colorado, and it is losing. 60% are in favor of keeping the prohibition there. And an early return on a proposition from Michigan, there's a proposition there which determines whether or not they will continue spending Medicaid funds for abortion, and the pro-life forces or the anti-abortion forces there are losing.
Well, you're talking about California. If you spend as much time in cars and on freeways as many or most Californians do, automobile insurance becomes of vital importance. So there's a proposition to force the rates down. One of them, I think, put forward by Ralph Nader.
Yes, the one that recalls for insurance rates to come down by about 20%,
yes,
and is the one, if anyone passes, that people think is going to pass in California. Take a quick last look here for the moment at our electoral calendar now. George Bush has 271 by our estimate, and Michael Dukakis has 83. We're going to go away for a few minutes now so that you have an opportunity to concentrate much more than we've been able to do here on the local politics in your region and the local issues. But David and I will be back at the top of the hour with the rest of the national campaign. Hope you'll join us then.
From the ABC News News Election Night Command Center. This is the 88 Vote.
Good evening. It's 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'm Peter Jennings along with David Brinkley. The polls have now closed in 5 more states, so we are now in a position to make projections in 5 more states. In Utah, we project that George Bush wins in Ronald Reagan's best state in 1980 and in 1984. No doubt that was going to Republican. In Idaho, the only uncertainty was going to be the margin. George Bush, we project, in Idaho. Solid Republican state. Dukakis was never competitive there. In Nevada, we also project George Bush. The only question there tonight, we'll come to it, is whether he can carry in Senator Chick Hecht for a second term. A projection for Michael Dukakis in Iowa, where he did not win the caucuses at the beginning of the year. We project he wins the 8 electoral votes there tonight. Iowa, where the whole process started, David Brinkley, ages and ages and ages and ages ago.
And it took him 8 months to get back to Iowa and win it. He lost it the first time. We also have another projection, which again is no big surprise. This is in the state of Utah. We project the winner in the race for the Senate is the incumbent Orrin Hatch, Republican. He defeated a man named Brian Moss, who was the son of a Senator Frank Moss, whom Hatch defeated in 1976. Now, 12 years later, he defeats his son. Orrin Hatch, the winner, Republican, Senate, Utah. And that brings us up to 10 o'clock.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the 88 Vote. With Sam Donaldson at the Dukakis headquarters in Boston, Britt Hume at the Bush headquarters in Houston, James Wooten and Barry Seraphin on Capitol Hill, Lynn Scherr and Jeff Greenfield in New York. And now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
There are some states at the presidential level at the moment which are simply too close to call, and I'll run those down for you. They are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, and Vermont. And as of poll closings at 10 o'clock just a few minutes ago, Montana is too close to call, and Colorado, New Mexico, and South Dakota, which closed their polls over an hour ago, are also too close to call. We also can now make a projection in the Florida Senate race, where Kenneth Buddy McKay, the Democrat, the more liberal of the two candidates, we project, has won against Connie Mack. Mack had hoped for coattails from George Bush. He didn't get them. Florida's looking more and more like a Republican state every day at the presidential level, but there's another example tonight of people splitting their vote, and we project that Buddy McKay, who is the Democrat, who had a really rigorous primary season amongst his fellow Democrats, they finally came together and pulled it out for him there, and that is, I said, a reflection, David, of ticket splitting, which we've seen in a lot of places around the country.
Well, I think we're going to live with, those who object to it are going to live with the Democratic Congress into the future, distant future. In the House of Representatives, there is almost no turnover. The last time I think it was 98 point something of those who ran for re-election who won. The Senate, it's not quite that high, but it's very close to it. Once you get into Congress, you stay there for life. So the Democratic is going to remain so.
I think in the House it was. I think you're very close. I think it was either 97.5
90-something
of incumbents who returned 4 years ago. So we'll obviously, they have this tremendous advantage of money. Candidates for Congress raised this year $360 million, and they got a third of that from political action committees. And the overwhelming amount of money from political action committees goes to incumbents, as you well know. I don't know why I'm telling you this.
The members of Congress have spent a generation and more rigging the electoral process to favor themselves. They can mail out free newsletters, their opponents can't. And there are a dozen other things that they can do. They pile up money, just pile it up.
We mentioned the Senate race in Florida. There is, the polls have not closed, as you know, in California. And there is, of course, still a very important Senate race in California where Pete Wilson, the incumbent, is running against the Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy out there. And that is one, to refer to what David was just saying, of the most expensive races in the country. But one we'll be watching very carefully in California tonight. Let's go to Washington, however, where ABC's Jim Wooten is standing by with one of the best-known Republicans in the country, Senator Robert Dole. Jim?
Senator Dole will join us in just a moment. I wanted to talk to you a little bit, Peter, about all of these Senate races that we've projected so far. 28 races across the country we've called the winners in that. 18 of them were won by Democrats so far, 9 of them by Republicans. That leaves only 6 left. According to our count, we're showing that's a pickup of 2 seats for the Democrats, which would take their majority to 56-44. What that means, of course, is that Senator Robert Dole, who's with us now, come in here, Senator, is the leader of a minority that's even more of a minority, I suppose.
Well, we still have some possibilities in Montana. We have a chance for a pickup. We want to hold Montana, Wyoming, and California. We've got some key races, and if we lose those, we are going to be a real minority, and it's going to be tougher for George Bush than he thought.
Given what's happened so far, it may be tough. David Brinkley was raising a question a few moments ago about the existence, perhaps, of a honeymoon. With this kind of a Senate, with the kind of a campaign we've had and its tone, is there going to be a honeymoon for George Bush?
I'd go back to what Lloyd Bentsen said, and I have a lot of respect for Lloyd Bentsen. He said last week in one of the programs I watched that, yes, when it comes to governing, we have to do it. And we're going to try to work with the new president, whether it be Dukakis or George Bush. It's going to be George Bush, and I believe we can work together. But it's going to be tougher because the bottom line in this town is how many votes do you have? And we're going to have fewer than we had last year. And I must say, we could have used a little help from the vice president in some of those states. Florida, we pleaded with them to go to Florida, but we lost that. Nevada, they flew over Nevada several times. We're going to win Nevada in any event. But it's... You've got a combination, as David also said, of big business and big labor sort of perpetuating Democrats in power. He didn't say that, I say that.
You've had previous business with George Bush in campaigning. He slugged you pretty good in New Hampshire with some commercials. What did you think of the tone of the Bush campaign?
Well, I was told in New Hampshire that people didn't like negative ads, so we didn't run any. I lost. So, you know, I think negative ads do get your attention. I think they do focus on a weakness, in my case, whatever it was. But George Bush is a good, decent person. He'll be a good person to work with. He's going to try to bring a consensus in the Congress, and I think he can do it. He knows most every member of Congress, Republicans and Democrats.
You've been reading his lips, Senator?
Well, not lately.
What about no new taxes? Is that possible?
I want to let Lloyd Bentsen and George Bush settle that. 2 Texans, both on the ticket, and they can get together and work that matter. But I'll help George Bush. He said no new taxes. I'll be the Republican leader, and we'll help him try to keep that promise.
Peter?
Senator Dole, I was just listening to your observation about trying to get George Bush to go to Florida to help Connie Mack down there. Is the implication there that George Bush doesn't have many coattails around the country?
Well, so far, you look at Connecticut, we've lost one, and look in Florida, we've lost one. I don't think there are any coattails in this race. We hope to win in Montana, but it's unfortunate, but I think if George Bush wins big, we don't gain any seats in the House, we lose 3 or 4 seats in the Senate. That's going to make it more difficult.
What does that say about a mandate such as the one George Bush has asked the country for?
Well, it's not a mandate. I think it's probably as much a mandate as Jack Kennedy had or Jimmy Carter. But I think the mandate, I think the business is already there. In my view, we've got to deal with the deficit. Nobody's talked much about that. And hopefully we can find enough of us working with the president, the new president, to deal with that first. Beyond that, I don't know of any real mandate. We've got to address a lot of issues, but I would hope the mandate is to deal with the deficit.
Senator, you said in New Hampshire they told you people didn't like negative campaigning, so you didn't do it, and you lost. Does that mean, you suppose, that from here on we're going to see my opponent's a liar and a thief and he lets murderers out of jail, this and that? Is that our future?
Well, I hope not. I think a certain amount of negative comparative campaigning, I guess ads, as Roger Ailes calls them, are okay, but we're going to have to be fairly careful. Maybe we can figure out some better way in the next couple of years, the next 4 years. But we have to look at campaign finance reform. Otherwise, incumbents are never going to lose around this place, Republicans or Democrats. They'll lose a few seats, we'll lose a few, but incumbents have a big, big advantage that the challenger doesn't have, and I'm an incumbent, so I can say that with some credibility, and we're going to have to take a look at how we finance campaigns and put some limit on political action committees or wipe them out altogether.
Senator Dole, thank you very much for taking the time. Jim, we'll come back to you, if we may, a little later on for a further assessment of the Senate race. You want to take a look at the House now and go across to the other side of Capitol Hill and Barry Sarafin. Barry?
Well, Peter, Senator Dole was just talking about the big advantage that incumbents have in money from political action committees and elsewhere. You and David were talking a little earlier about the lack of turnover in Congress. Well, let me give you an example. Let me give you the current projection for the new Congress, that is the new House of Representatives. It looks right now, according to ABC's projection, as though the Democrats will pick up exactly 1 seat out of all these 435 races when all the dust settles. Incumbents indeed do have a huge advantage. We should point out that in the House of Representatives, there are about 60 incumbents running with no opponents, and yet they've collected $15 million, including $7.5 million from political action committees. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Barney. We'll come back to you for another look at how the race is going. David, you know, Senator Dole raised a number of things we can talk about. The deficit. I did not do a scientific survey, but as I wandered around the country for 10 days, I found 2 issues people talked about, whether they were rich or poor, black or white, old or young. One was the deficit. There was the feeling that it was coming to haunt their children and to haunt their grandchildren. And the other, we'll ask Lynn Sure about this earlier this evening, or later this evening, was the homeless. The deficit and the homeless were the things that people wanted to talk about. I do not know at all whether they have showed up in tonight's exit polls. We'll be back right after these messages.
From the ABC News Election Night Command Center in New York, the 88 vote continues. Once again, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
It is 10:15 Eastern Standard Time, and the polls have continued to close around the country. You can see what our map looks like at the moment. We're now in a position to make 2 more projections. One that has been too close to call for some time, Michigan. We now project will go for George Bush. There was a big battle up there for the blue-collar Reagan Democrats. George Bush appears to have won it. And as we move out to the west, we also project that Colorado will go for George Bush as well. Dukakis had tried to break the Republican lock on the mountain states there, and he failed. There's been a prolonged energy recession in Colorado, and yet George Bush and President Reagan have not suffered tonight as a result of that. So what we're left with at the moment, aside from those places on the West Coast where the polls have not closed, where there are interesting Senate races, where there are all sorts of propositions, are some too close to call states being Pennsylvania, Illinois, still no word there from Vermont, and also Montana, New Mexico, and South Dakota. Where the polls have closed, we estimate are now still too close to call. David, an observation?
Well, I would like to turn to Mr. Kissinger, who has just come to join us, and ask you, do you find it strange that we have, during this campaign, heard so little about foreign policy in general, and next to nothing about the changes in the Soviet Union and what they might mean to us sometime?
It's strange because I think that in foreign policy there were really major differences between the 2 candidates, and that might have given some kind of a mandate for where to go had they been more fully discussed. In fact, I think that the Vice President gave at least 2 speeches that I know about that were very thoughtful, that I never saw covered anywhere.
He has made the same complaint, I might say.
And,
well, were you... Go ahead, Peter.
I was going to say, you really define foreign policy in an election campaign, don't you, by how well we're getting along with the Soviets and whether or not other countries are threatening us with their trade policies. Is there any other reason that's important?
But the real problem we'll have in the next administration is how do we define getting along well with the Soviets? And can't continue to define it in terms of personal relationships with Gorbachev, because he won't be there forever, and we don't really know what his ultimate strategy will be. So the president-elect will have to define the political framework for relations with the Soviets in addition to arms control.
If you were advising or organizing a political campaign for one of them, what would you tell him to say about the Soviet Union?
I would say that we have not only 70 years of communist history, but 400 years of Russian history. And the congenital problem with the Russian state has been that they have felt insecure, partly with reason, but partly because they could not be reassured except through the impotence of their neighbors. So there has been a constant expansion of the Russian state ever since the 17th century. And the problem of peace in relation with the Soviet Union and with the Russian state is whether they're willing to accept living in a state of balance with their neighbors. And to put that into some concrete terms, that is the big challenge. And I think opportunity, because if the Soviets cannot negotiate it now when they have major domestic problems, and when all the surrounding countries are growing faster than they do, then when are we ever going to negotiate?
I have three sort of short-term practical questions, Dr. Kissinger. Did George Bush, President-elect, if you will, say anything in this campaign which will impair his dealing with the Soviets to the best of your knowledge?
No, I think what he has said, the speeches that I have read, will be helpful.
What about the idea that was broached during the campaign that President Reagan should have another meeting with Mr. Gorbachev and take George Bush along with him, as if to provide a transition?
I think that the president-elect should now take a few weeks or months or whatever time he needs to define what he wants to achieve. Then I like the idea of a philosophical meeting with Gorbachev in which they define their agenda and don't try to negotiate. But to try to rush an agreement in the last few weeks of the Reagan administration, or to give the impression that there's some personal relationship that can be transferred from one to the other, I don't think that would be helpful at all. We have to get to substance now. We have to get it away from personality.
On the eve of our election, the Soviet Union's most famous dissident, Andrei Sakharov, has arrived in the United States for a visit, whereas a couple of years ago he was in internal exile. Does that augur well for Soviet-American relations in the months ahead, at least?
I think Sakharov is a moving and great man. I've had the privilege of meeting him. He's indicated, incidentally, he's in favor of the economic reform program of Gorbachev. He's worried about the accumulation of power in the personality of Gorbachev. I don't think we can make our foreign policy depend on the internal evolution of the Soviet Union. And we have to put it into terms of national security. I think there are major changes going on in the Soviet Union, but I sometimes have the impression that Gorbachev has thrown a lot of balls up into the air, and he's not yet pulled very many of them down. And so we can't just rely on him. We have to make our own input.
My last question is fairly obvious. Any role for Henry Kissinger in the Bush administration? Would you like to serve in government again?
No, I'll be a friendly outside advisor. And,
no desire to be on the inside again?
No.
Said he hesitatingly.
Well, no, there's, this is like these vice presidential questions. You either sound coy or cute, and I'm happy with my present life.
Okay, we won't characterize it as coy or cute. Thanks, Dr. Kissinger, for coming to join us.
Thanks for coming.
A very brief stop in Houston before we go to Asprey Hume. What's the vice president's schedule in the next little while, Britt?
The official schedule, Peter, is for him to come here in about 45 minutes. That's the schedule that was handed out to us much earlier in the day. We haven't seen any members of the high command here to talk to us or spin us, as it were, but I think that they're beginning to arrive here now. I think it's become fairly clear, at least in their eyes, that they've got it.
Okay, Britt, thanks very much. One of the things that Mr. Bush and Mr. Dukakis both said before tonight was that they were not going to make any public comments about victory or defeat until after the polls had closed on the West Coast. So it may be some time before we see or hear from either one of them. We will be back shortly.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the American electoral process. This is the 88 Vote. Now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center in New York, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
10:30 Eastern Standard Time. ABC News now projects that in the state of Montana, George Bush is going to be the winner in Big Sky Country. 4 electoral votes, George Bush to take Montana. David.
Well, I also have a projection from Montana. Doc Melcher, the veterinarian who had the commercial of cows talking to each other, has lost. Kindly old Doc Melcher, they called him. He was defeated by Conrad Burns, a Republican. which was a surprise. They thought in Montana that Doc Melcher would win. He didn't.
And let's go back there to that vote board again, the electoral board again, and take a look at what George Bush now has with that win in Montana. By our projection, he has 316 electoral votes. Michael Dukakis has 91. And it may be, David, that we are tiptoeing around the story of the night here, even though the polls have not closed in the West. As we said earlier in the day, it is quite possible for a presidential candidate to put together the 270 electoral votes needed in the East and the Midwest. And we're talking about having elected a new president of the United States tonight, George Bush.
We are indeed talking about it. It does appear that that is what we have done. There was some talk about winning losing the popular vote and winning the electoral vote. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I was really just more talking about the fact that there is a reluctance, I think, in the media to take a look at the map and say it isn't all over until the West Coast votes. But let's look at the map again. It is just so easy to put together the 270 electoral votes while not hearing from Oregon and Washington and California and Hawaii and Alaska.
And Pennsylvania.
And Pennsylvania, which is too close to call, and Illinois and Vermont and New Mexico and South Dakota, which are still too close to call. But all you have to do is take a look at that tonight, and there is no doubt, I think, in anybody's mind that George Bush is going to be the next president of the United States. So let us canvass the nation and see how that news is playing in the various campaigns. Let's go to Boston first, to the Dukakis campaign headquarters, and Sam Donaldson. Sam, what's happening?
Well, Peter, I'm staking out the back door of the World Trade Center here in Boston. Most of my career has been staking out the back door rather than the front door. But it's here that Michael Dukakis will come in just a few minutes. He's left his home in Brookline. He's on the way. His supporters, of course, are inside waiting to greet him. He won't actually go on stage until after 11 o'clock for the obvious reason. The polls will not have closed in the West. And unlike Jimmy Carter, who in 1980, disastrously, many Democrats thought, conceded the election before the polls had closed in the West, Michael Dukakis is not going to do that. But he'll come here, then sometime after 11 o'clock, he'll go out and he'll make whatever statement he thinks appropriate before his supporters.
What do the people in the hall have to say, Sam?
Oh, the mood is kind of, I won't say grim, but no one is cheering and yelling. Once in a while, someone will get up and they'll say, we won a great victory tonight in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's gone overwhelmingly for Dukakis and Benson. Everyone will go, hooray. And then they'll announce another state. But everybody understands that the network projections are what they are, and the evening is not going well for the governor.
In fact, Sam, while you're just standing there, we're going to project New Mexico for George Bush with its 5 electoral votes there. And the largest percentage of Hispanic votes in the country in New Mexico goes to George Bush. And Sam, you mentioned Massachusetts. In talking to folks up there today, there are a lot of Democrats in Massachusetts who are kind of laying for Mike Dukakis. Am I right or wrong?
Well, I think that's true. Dukakis in the last several months of his administration has been under a great deal of fire, particularly, for instance, on the budget. He likes to say that he's balanced 10 budgets, but the one he's got at the moment is out of balance because of slowness in receipts. And there are people who are going to say, if he loses this election tonight, that that's it for you, Mike. You need not apply to run for governor again in 1990, which is when his term is up. He is not someone, I mean, Dukakis is a very controversial figure here. He's not universally loved, he's not universally hated, he's sort of on the edge, and he's not someone who automatically will be reelected, even though he was rejected by the nation.
Sam, you've used the phrase again, if he loses the election tonight. Is there anyone in the Dukakis camp, to the best of your knowledge, who will not know now that Michael Dukakis has lost the 1988 presidential election?
Well, I suppose not. I was talking to Susan Estridge a few minutes ago, the campaign manager. Of course, she's not going to concede for her candidate. That's up to him to concede if he wishes to. And I tried out on her something we were saying earlier tonight, and that is that if it's a narrow loss, not the blowout that a lot of the polls predicted, there would be a lot of backbiting and a lot of recriminations. If only we'd done this, if only we'd done that. Her view is just the opposite. She says if it's a narrow loss, we will be very proud because the Democratic Party cannot feel rejected. It will not be a rejection for the party. It will be a much better thing.
Okay, Sam, thank you very much. We'll come back to you. And, of course, as the point we've made earlier this evening, David, is that the Democratic Party has not been rejected by any means, because at the Senate level and at the House level and the governor's chairs, the Democrats are doing exceedingly well.
Yeah, they still have Congress and show every sign of keeping it as far ahead as we can see. Democrats, they have not been rejected.
What does that say to you about the presidential candidates, that it really comes down to personality?
Well, people very often say that the American people like divided government. They like a Congress of one party and the White House another. I've never really run into anyone who said, I like divided government. I'm going to vote for the president in one party and a congressman in another. I think it's just how it works out. Congress, members of Congress are essentially local officials. People know them. They write them letters all the time. They send them little booklets and send them pictures and so on, all free at taxpayers' expense. And so they get themselves reelected.
In other words, I think what you're saying is the people don't go into the polling booth and say, hi, I'm voting here for checks and balances tonight.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Let's go down to Houston now and talk to Britt Hume, who's been covering the Bush campaign from the beginning. So what's the mood down there, Britt?
Well, Peter, the mood down here is very jubilant, and the people have been filing into this this ballroom here at the George Brown Convention Center in growing numbers over the last 30 to 45 minutes, and the three networks have now all projected George Bush the winner, and that caused a huge roar to go up here just a little while ago. There are a couple of men you may be able to see behind me up on the stage there, putting a big sign up on the curtain that says "America wins." For the last couple of minutes, I haven't been able to hear very much of our broadcast because the music has been going very, very loud. There's a bunch of country and western singers here. As you know, George Bush loves that kind of music, and the same people that have been doing the PA work at George Bush's rallies have obviously done the speaker work here because it's absolutely deafening. That may be the reason why demonstrators never had much luck drowning out George Bush. It was because he had so many amps of amplification behind him that it was impossible, and that's the way it's going to be here in a little while when he comes and the music is going at the same time.
Okay, Brett, well, we'll come back to that notwithstanding and listen to you. We could hear you actually quite well up here, despite what it must have seemed like in your ear. Let's go over now in our election headquarters and listen to Jeff Greenfield. Jeff, we have another president, next president.
Yeah, it seems so, and we've also got a Senate that is going to have more Democrats than before. Let me point out something to you. 1972, in the Nixon landslide, the Democrats picked up 2 Senate seats. 1984, the Reagan re-election landslide, the Democrats picked up 2 Senate seats. What's the one exception? 1980, when Ronald Reagan won by 10 points, and 12 Democrats lost, and 33 Democratic congressmen lost, despite all the incumbency advantages David Brinkley talked about. Why? Because 1980 was an ideological election. It was a very coherent political choice. And for my money, the lesson is when you have a presidential election, which we do every so often, decided on clear ideological grounds, you have a much more likely chance of the Congress moving in that direction. When you have a relatively contentless election, and I'll go out on the limb and say this was one of them, it's much easier for a voter to go in and split his ticket. And I think that is what is happening tonight. Peter, David?
What's your own feeling, Jeff, about the effect this has on the West Coast? I know you've spent a lot of time studying whether or not people in the West are really affected.
Yeah, the biggest problem that I have with that argument is I don't know who leaves the polls when we announce who wins. Is it, in this case, Bush supporters who know their guy has won, or Dukakis supporters who know the guy has lost? It seems to me very unlikely, particularly in an election where all the polls for weeks have been saying George Bush would win, that a dedicated voter would go to the polls and then somehow hear the network newscast and go home. I think restraint is a good idea on our part for its own sake, but I have never yet figured out which are the voters that we're supposed to be driving back from the polls.
Okay. Jeff, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that people who left without voting because they thought it was over, would they not have voted essentially the same as those who did get in to vote?
Well, you're asking me to do exactly what I'm criticizing our critics for doing, which is to speculate. I think
it's pure speculation,
yes,
obviously.
I think it's reasonable to assume that voters on the West Coast who have tight Senate races all through that region and who have tight congressional races and incredibly controversial propositions are smarter than to just leave and go home when what was likely to happen for the last few weeks has apparently happened. I've just never bought that argument.
I must confess that some of the complaints, Jeff, have come from the state of Washington, where the race between Dukakis and Bush was deemed for a long period of time to be very close. We don't know how that's going to turn out tonight. We're obviously going to stay around until they report in, but that is where the complaints came from 4 years ago, and maybe where they'll come from again tonight. The question is, how are people voting, and why are they voting? What issues are they voting for? Are they voting for a candidate? Are they voting against a candidate? Let's go to the upper deck and ABC's Lynn Sherr.
Peter, we have some information on a couple of those toss-up states you've been referring to. The big industrial states of Illinois and Pennsylvania, too close to call still at this hour. And one of the reasons is that in these states, there is a real battle for the Democrats who voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984. Let's take a look at the numbers. Just for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, the 84 Reagan Democrats, Bush is getting 45%, Dukakis 54%. Now, what that means is that Dukakis is holding on to enough of those so-called Reagan Democrats to keep it close. That is also happening in Illinois. Let's go to another issue, or rather another way the voters are voting, and this is called gender. Men are splitting their vote. 50 for Bush, 49% for Dukakis. This again in Pennsylvania. However, when it comes to women, the majority are voting for Mike Dukakis. 55-44. The same thing is happening in Illinois. So it seems that in these two states, Illinois and Pennsylvania, so far too close to call, the traditional Democratic coalition seems to be coming home to Dukakis. They seem to be leaving Reagan, and that's one of the reasons why those races are so tight right now. Gentlemen?
Okay, Lynn, thanks very much. And that may tell us something about the last-minute campaigning that Michael Dukakis indulged in, what some people will call too little too late, in Pennsylvania and Illinois, where he gave new life to the liberal image, even though it's an image which many liberals in Massachusetts don't think he deserves, but that's how he campaigned in the final days of the campaign in Illinois specifically and in Pennsylvania. We'll be back because we're waiting for Michael Dukakis to appear. We'll be back in just a moment.
ABC News election night coverage of the 88 vote will continue in a moment.
That's a familiar sight to those of us along the campaign trail this year. Michael Dukakis showing up in a motorcade with his wife Kitty, this time arriving at the Boston World Trade Center, where he and his staff and his supporters have made their headquarters this evening in Boston.
Well, Governor, looks like a pretty tough night for you.
There is Sam.
I'll be speaking inside, Sam. How do you feel, Mr. Dukakis?
Okay, all right.
Governor, any regrets that you didn't start earlier? Mrs. Dukakis, Kitty Dukakis and the governor just arriving from their home in Brookline on Perry Street. The governor said he'd be speaking inside when he was asked whether it wasn't a tough night for him. Clearly he understands the arithmetic of everything, Peter and David, but he's not going to appear to make any sort of a statement until at least after 11 o'clock when the polls have closed in California.
Sam, as he said earlier, that he would not make a statement until after the polls have closed in California, but an impressive thing to me there, he's always stopped, hasn't he, along the campaign trail to talk to you, different from George Bush in that respect.
Well, during the last 2 or 3 weeks, he's stopped to talk a little bit. He was in a period, Peter, I must tell you, in September and early October when he was stiffing reporters on the trail also on the theory that he didn't want our questions and his answers to get in the way of what his daily message was. Pretty good theory, I suppose, except his message wasn't much during that period, and it would have been better, I suppose, had he answered the questions.
And Sam, I don't know whether the rule will apply to Senator Benson, but there he is in Texas this evening with his wife, a man who will return to Washington as the senator from Texas, but there he is in Austin this evening coming to greet his supporters. He really, in some respects, has had the best of both worlds in Texas and Compton at his headquarters.
Yes, I can hear you.
Go ahead, Annie.
This is Lloyd Benson's great moment with his Texas family, but it's a bittersweet one. Lloyd Benson really had thought up until the end there was a chance that he could pull out some greater strength here in Texas. And although he is emerging from this campaign, something with a white hat on, it's got to be a bittersweet moment. He doesn't have any interest in being a leader in the National Party, but he certainly will, especially with a Senate advantage for the Democrats, try to exert himself now on the issues of the party. He'll be heading up to Boston either tomorrow or Thursday to meet with Governor Dukakis. There with his wife, B.A., the woman he calls his best asset. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Ann. And his father, his 95-year-old father, off to his right, who set him up in business many years ago, set him on the road to becoming a millionaire as well as a successful politician in Congress, from whence he quit and then went running for the Senate. And, of course, he has not done it in Texas for Michael Dukakis. But let's hear what he has to say this evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful to be with our friends. We're just delighted to be home in Texas. I've about given this voice away crossing this great country of ours. But I'm so pleased to be home with our family and with this packed room and the room back there where they can't see us. And I know This. There they are. They come. Well, this evening is still early, but it's not. Boy, my voice is just about gone. The last speech was at 3 o'clock this morning at a rally here in Austin. I think yesterday we did 4 states and 8 rallies, and I don't know how many interviews, that sort of thing. It's been an incredible experience. The evening is still early, but it's not too early to claim victory in my re-election to the United States Senate.
Just in case you haven't kept up with it, this is a law that was put back in Lyndon Johnson's day when he was running as vice president with Jack Kennedy, that if he lost with Kennedy, he could still represent Texas in the Senate. And that's exactly what Lloyd Bentsen will do. He will continue to represent Texas as, among other things, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee.
Those returns are not complete, but they sure are conclusive. And I didn't want to wait a minute longer to thank the people of Texas for their wonderful and generous support and their commitment to me. I'd also like to make a comment about Mike Dukakis. He and I waged a campaign that's worthy of the American people.
In many polls, people said they would have preferred Lloyd Bentsen at the top of the ticket. He was, in many ways, on occasion, the most popular campaigner of the 4 throughout the year.
We told you the truth, and we stepped up to those issues. We challenged America to do better. We fought fair, and we never quit. And we never lost our faith in the truth. That's what you need in a campaign. I have never seen a candidate that worked any harder, or in those last 3 or 4 weeks delivered a message any stronger than did Mike Dukakis in those closing days. And he made me proud to be his friend.
Not quite sure whether this is an acceptance speech in his senator's race or a concession speech as a vice presidential candidate. If it's the latter, it's the first time ever that a vice presidential candidate is conceded before the presidential one.
His running mate, and he made me proud to be an American.
Well, it hasn't really said anything about that, I mean.
But right now I want to focus on Texas, because Texas is our home. This has been an unusual campaign. I recognize the difficulties that you had to go through as friends of mine and supporters of mine. I think truly unlike any campaign that's gone before. Every hazard was there, every difficulty was twice as hard, and victory is twice as sweet in that Senate race. And your efforts are very important, because there's still a lot of work to do. A lot to be done for this great state of ours that's really taken some hits. Been through one of the toughest decades in the history of our great state. But we all know that the people of Texas have been through those crises before. From the Alamo to the Dust Bowl to the Great Depression, the boom and bust of the energy industry, we have always solved those problems. And we've always come back tougher than before. Because the people of this great state, they have spirit. They're risk takers. You bet. Applaud any time you want.
Well, little bits of history. Texas has, or no Democrat has ever won the White House without winning Texas since Texas joined the Union. Lloyd Dukakis hasn't mentioned it, but he was supposed to win Texas for Mike Dukakis.
Work hard to overcome any adversity.
The Republicans said when he was chosen that the Democrats were committing political suicide in Texas. He spent about a third of his campaign there, and the result is that Mike Dukakis loses in Texas, and Lloyd Bentsen, by a strange, I think, David, Texas-only law, is returned to the Senate.
Far as I know, I would like to say something that Lloyd Bentsen probably will not say because it would seem cantankerous if he said it. But to be chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, a senior member of the Senate, with a vote.
I know what you're going to say.
What I'm going to say is a better job than being vice president. Vice president has a gavel, period. And numerous people who have been asked to be vice president said, no, I'd rather have a vote than a gavel. He's going back to where he was before, having had a rich and no doubt rewarding experience running for the vice presidency, going back to where he was with increased respect in the Senate.
Certainly increased stature throughout
Everything has gone right for it.
most of the country among Democrats.
Right.
It'll be interesting to ask Andy Compton a little later in the evening whether or not he really feels unhappy or not. But in the meantime, at 5 minutes before 11 Eastern Standard Time, 3 minutes before the polls close in California, Oregon, and Washington, we'll be back.
Agenda, coming Monday on ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
ABC News coverage of the 88 vote. Brought to you by Citicorp.
Welcome back to our election headquarters in New York. You can see back up there on the map what it looks like. We're just a few minutes away now from poll closing time in the states of Washington and Oregon and California. Hawaii and Alaska are still to come. We can now project a couple of other states which have been too close to call up until now. In South Dakota, we project that George Bush is going to be the winner there. Dukakis had campaigned hard for South Dakota. It's the state that would have preferred Bob Dole, of course, to George Bush. In Vermont, which has voted Democrat only once in its history, we project that George Bush is the winner. In the state of Vermont, with its 3 electoral votes, a sort of overall popular vote as of now. 46% of the precincts have reported in from around the country. 54% of those reporting in are going for George Bush, and 46% are going for Michael Dukakis. In the Senate, there's a net gain of 1 for the Democrats so far based on our projection. There are still a couple of fascinating Senate races still to be resolved, 1 in the state of Washington and 1 in the state of California particularly. Governors, the Democrats have a net gain of 2 so far. They took Indiana and West Virginia from the Republicans based on our projections so far. And in the House, not much change at all. As David has been pointing out a number of times this evening, not much ever changes in the House in terms of incumbents. The Democrats have a net gain only of 1.
So percentage-wise, I don't know what that is, but it's very large or very small. One thing before we go, Peter, that I think should not be lost, and that is a George Bush sentence, which I treasure. I think everyone will. It is this, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that undecided voters could go either way." Okay.
Got one more?
No, I'll get Bush to give you one if you want.
Okay. We are going to tell our local stations a small piece of information. Well, we're going to go off here on time at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time to accommodate local stations all around the country who want to do their late local news at this point or their local election cutaways. That's an agreement we had made earlier. We are going to come back at any time that Michael Dukakis appears at his campaign headquarters in Boston there to make his concession speech. And George Bush, of course, is going to make what is clearly a victory speech shortly after 11 o'clock Eastern Time as well. So we'll either be back when Michael Dukakis shows up to make a concession speech between 11 and 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, or we'll come back at the end of the half hour. Now, David, you're going to have another go there.
Well, I don't really have another go. The so-called negative campaign has been interesting. One of the Democrats said George Bush made it sound as if if Michael Dukakis were installed as president, in about 15 minutes, a burglars would be climbing into your bedroom window. And they're furious about it. I think the negative campaigning, it's not new, granted, but we haven't had that much of it lately.
If I had time to go to Jeff Greenfield now, he would have told us an awful lot about this because he's writing a novel, the plot of which involves the Electoral College. But the Electoral College, as most people know, is not a college, but electoral representatives will meet in about a month from now in their various state capitals to actually cast the votes, which will make George Bush the 41st president of the United States. On January the 6th, the vice president opens and counts the ballots in the presence of the House and the Senate. And Bush will proclaim himself president-elect. We'll be back when Michael Dukakis shows up. Standard Time, November the 8th, 1988, Dukakis election night headquarters. He is about to come down for one of the most important, one of the terminal moments on election night. The losing candidate comes to make his concession speech. His supporters have been gathered there for many, many hours. They started off at least with a public image that they could pull it out this evening, and they failed to do so. Sam Donaldson.
Governor, here comes Governor Dukakis and Kitty Dukakis down a ramp, a runway in the World Trade Center here in Boston. He was preceded by members of his family, his daughters Andrea and Kara, his son John, John's wife Lisa, his mother Turpie Dukakis, his father-in-law Harry Ellis Dixon. There they are on the stage in this large cavernous hall. Lots of supporters here. Very, very good crowd. The crowd, of course, knows what the governor is going to tell them as far as who won and who lost tonight. But I must tell you, there has not been any weeping that I've seen. And here they are. Mike Dukakis, after 48 hours of campaigning nonstop prior to this election morning. This afternoon, he actually went power walking, which is his exercise in his neighborhood in Brookline, Massachusetts. I suppose he's gotten a little sleep. His wife, Kitty, who campaigned both with him and separately in this last closing 10-day period. You know, it's interesting. Early on, the governor would come out before crowds and almost immediately begin to speak. But now he savors the applause, pointing at one of his supporters. The music, of course, you hear Coming to America, the theme song that he used all during his campaign. The red, white, and blue Dukakis Benson posters that were the statement of his campaign, being raised by a lot of his supporters here in the hall. You know, it's tough on nights like this for losing candidates. But I must tell you, so far, there hasn't been a lot of weeping in this hall.
Thank you all very, very much. Kitty and I and our family can't even begin to express our gratitude to you and to hundreds of thousands of people like you across this country who have given so much to us and to the American people in the last 18 months. Just a few minutes ago, I called Vice President Bush and congratulated him on his victory. And I know I speak for all of you and for all the American people when I say that he will be our president and we'll work with him. This nation faces major challenges ahead and we must work together. And I extended my best wishes to him and to Mrs. Bush and to the members of the Bush family. Kitty and I
What they're chanting, I believe, is 92, 92.
Kitty and I also had a chance to talk to Lloyd and B.A. Benson. And I know we express your feelings when I say that he and she were superb running mates. They're wonderful friends. I'm so proud of that choice, so proud of both of them, and we have formed a friendship which will last as long as we live on this planet. They are two wonderful people, and Lloyd Benson has been one of the great assets of this campaign. Just 18 months ago, on what, as some of you will recall, was a cold and snowy April day, I asked you for your support in running what I called a marathon for the highest honor that the American people can bestow on anyone. I said there'd be good days, and we had a lot of good days, didn't we? And I said there'd be not so good days, and we had a few of those too. And I talked about another marathon that I had run in April of 1951, when I found myself struggling up a hill or two and people saying to me, "Looking good, Duke, go to it." That is what you have done, and I'm very grateful to you. We had those good and not so good days. We reached Heartbreak Hill and overcame it. And then we found the strength to make that final kick. And tonight my heart is filled with gratitude to everyone who has made this extraordinary experience of ours possible. From my friends and neighbors here in Massachusetts to those 3,000 people who were waiting for us at 3 o'clock this morning in Des Moines, Iowa. As I think back on this marathon, I'll never forget the beauty of this magnificent land, from those beautiful colonial villages of New Hampshire to the farmland of Iowa to the magnificence of Yellowstone and the California coast. But most of all, I'll remember the people I've met, their strength, their values, their generosity, and their hospitality to Kitty and me and to our family. And it is very important that we continue to fight for them and for families all across America. We've got to fight for that young family in Levittown on Long Island, New York, that wants to buy a home in the community in which they grew up and can't afford it. We've got to fight for that family in Sioux City, Iowa, that can't afford health insurance to pay the bills for its young son. We've got to fight for those high school students in Los Angeles who are saying no to drugs and yes to their future. We've got to open up that door of college opportunity to every young person in this country who is qualified to do college work. We've got to fight to end the shame of homelessness in this country, and this great and good nation ought to be able to do that. We've got to fight for those unemployed steel workers in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and Youngstown, Ohio, who ought to be able to have a good job at a good wage to support themselves and their families. And we've got to fight for those families I met with in Glen Avon, California, whose children today are permanently crippled because they happen to live next door to one of the worst toxic waste dumps in the United States of America. This campaign has not been just about me and Lloyd Bentsen. It's been about these families and the challenges they face every day of their lives. And it's been about all of us and the values and the ideals that we share. That's what we've been fighting for, and that is what we must continue to work for every day and every week and every month of our lives. I'm going to continue to work for these goals with you, with my fellow governors, with the Democratic Congress, and I'm proud to say that we not only will continue to have a Democratic Congress, but it looks as if a strengthened Democratic Senate. We'll be working with the new administration, and above all, I'll be working with the people of Massachusetts. Let me say thank you to many, many people in this country, those who gave us their support, those hundreds of thousands of volunteers who worked so hard and so long and so tirelessly. I want to thank the members of the world's oldest and greatest party, the Democratic Party, for all that they did. I want to thank this wonderful family of mine, Kitty and John and Andrea and Carr and Lisa, and my mother and Kitty's dad. They've been terrific. And let me simply conclude by saying this to all of you and to people like you all across the country, and especially to those of you who are young people. And there are many young people here. There is nothing you can do in this world more fulfilling and more satisfying than giving of yourself to others and making a contribution to your community and your state and your nation and your fellow citizens. And one of the things that I'm proudest of in this campaign is the thousands and thousands of young people who are involved. I don't want you to be discouraged. I want you to be encouraged by what you've done in this campaign. I hope many of you will go into politics and public service. It is a noble profession, a noble profession. I remember what my dad used to say to me over and over again: much has been given to you and much is expected of you. Much has been given to the young people of this country. The opportunity to live and grow up in the greatest nation on the face of this earth. And you have a responsibility to give something back. Our hearts are full. We love you all. We love this country. And we're going to continue to fight with you and with the American people so that every citizen of this country can be a full shareholder in the American dream. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
It looked to be pretty weak. Let me ask you both a question. Whether the party moves right or left, is there going to be a sort of romance about going back to smoke-filled rooms? The Democratic Party's had an enduring process which has produced a weak candidate.
Well, in the first place, there aren't enough smokers to fill a smoke-filled room anymore. Second, the original smoke-filled room was in the Blackstone Hotel, and it produced Warren Harding. He won a landslide, but was a miserable president. So I think that the romance of that is overrated. In fact, the Democratic Party's danger is that they may be viewed as a merely legislative party.
Okay, George, Will, and Tom Wicker, thanks very much. We'll come back to you a little later in the evening. But there you see it at Bush headquarters in Houston, with 327 electoral votes for himself on the board by our projection, the president-elect and Mrs. Bush. Michael Dukakis has 108 on our projected electoral vote board, and we shall see. Britt Hume in Houston is saying that we should be looking here now for signs of George Bush trying to mend some of the damage that has been done in the country, some of the divisiveness that has been caused by this campaign. He has won 36 states tonight, has George Herbert Walker Bush. David?
That's, you'll see it again in a minute. It's a mock-up of the White House they've had built in this hall in great confidence that it would be the future home of George Herbert Walker Bush.
We will hear a lot about him in the days ahead, but let's start. He was an unsuccessful candidate for the presidential nomination in 1980, CIA director, U.S. envoy to China, chairman of the Republican National Committee, UN ambassador, unsuccessful candidate for Senate, and now president-elect. Britt Hume in Houston.
Thank you all very much. There he goes, Peter. He's about to start, and I think what a great welcome. I'll let us listen.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. Hey, Jimmy.
That's his son over there behind him.
Of course,
Thank you. Thank you all. Where?
Peter.
Oh, he's there, yeah.
Peter, there's something interesting going on here. He's trying to get quiet, supposedly, but the band is still playing, and it's obvious that the place isn't going to be quiet until it stops. What you have here is a bit of supposedly...
Thank you all very much.
...spontaneous refusal to let the Vice President speak.
Thank you so much.
But the band is still playing. There. And it is still playing.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to get that word.
Thank you all. Thank you. First, thank you all very much. Thank you. I've just received a telephone call from Governor Dukakis. And I want you to know he was most gracious. His call was personal. It was genuinely friendly. And it was in the great tradition of American politics. And we can now speak the most majestic words a democracy has to offer. The people have spoken. And and with a full heart and with great hopes, I thank all the people throughout America who have given us this great victory. And I thank Ronald Reagan. I thank him for turning our country around and for being my friend and for going the extra mile on the hustings. It was just like him. He is simply one of the most decent men I have ever met. I want to thank my friend, my running mate Dan Quayle and his family. And they have shown great strength under fire, campaigned incessantly. And I am proud of him and proud of his family. I want to thank my great friend, Houston's son, Jim Baker, and our campaign Chairman Lee Atwater and the men and women of the campaign, the national staff, the RNC, all of our state chairmen and chairwomen and all the organizations and the political clubs, and I especially thank the young people who were always up at night putting up the signs, the people at those telephone banks and the one who canvassed door to door. And there's a large gathering of volunteers right now at the Washington Hilton, and my folks, my heart is with you, and many, many thanks for all you've done from our nation's capital. And I want to talk about my family. Fact is, I'd be nothing without them. Our 4 sons, our daughter Doro, and my own Barbara Bush, and I guess I shouldn't say she's my own anymore, for soon she'll be the First Lady of all the United States. And I thank God for the faith He's given me. And as I grow older, I'm more aware of the spiritual element in life, and I ask for God's help. And I thank the men and women of Texas. There are people right here, I recognize them, started out with me in politics in 1962, and you never lost faith, you never left me, and you're a source of my strength. And this is a moving night for all of us, and you can't help but be moved when your country endorses your hopes and your candidacy, and the feelings are so personal. But the decision is larger than that, and now we will move again for an America that is strong and resolute in the world, strong and big-hearted at home. And when I said I want a kinder, gentler nation, I meant it, and I mean it. A campaign is a disagreement, and disagreements divide. But an election is a decision, and decisions clear the way for harmony and peace. And I mean to be a president of all the people, and I want to work for the hopes and interests not only of my supporters, but of the governors and of those who didn't vote at all. To those who supported me, I will try to be worthy of your trust, and to those who did not, I will try to earn it, and my hand is out to you and I want to be your president too. But I think I know how Governor Dukakis feels. Lost a few along the way myself, and it hurts. But we both went into the arena, and we fought long and hard. And the governor can take great satisfaction in the fact that his valiant family, Kitty and Kara and Andrea and John, did him proud. And now I know that we'll come together, as we always have. 200 years of harmony in the oldest, greatest democracy in man's time on earth. And I've traveled many miles and reached for many hands, and it's occurred to me that what we were having, the people of America and I, was a conversation, a back and forth, a mutual dialogue, and it cannot go away. Not now, not when I need it most. And so I mean to keep the conversation going, to keep walking toward you, talking with you, and reaching for the hands. And another thing, I'll do my level best to reach out and work constructively with the United States Congress. And a final word about what you mean to me, my friends in this room. Every time Barbara and I come to Texas, it's a homecoming. We were young here. Started out here 40 years ago, summer of 48. Worked in the oil fields and, started a business and went into politics. 40 years. 40 years of work and caring and friendship. And now I'm going to take that love and friendship. It's all right here in this room. Put it in my pocket, take it with me to Washington, D.C., where it's sometimes cold, but always bracing. And where God knows there's lots of work to do. So thank you. God bless you. And one other thing. Once in days that were a little darker, I made a promise. And now I'll keep it. Thank you, New Hampshire. Thanks for everything, and God bless America. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Mrs. Bush is always at his side. They've lived in 17 cities and 28 homes since they got married in 1945. Mrs. Bush has always been the faithful, good political wife. She dropped out of Smith College to marry. And David, these pictures of the Bush family were really new to the nation at convention time.
Not much had been seen of them until the convention. This is a very, very long leap for George Bush. Until today, he had never carried even one state. Today he carried 36. He ran for the Senate in Texas twice, lost twice, did serve in Congress, carried a district, but never a state.
David, as always, you have an incredible sense of perspective. We'll be right back after this word from your local station.
Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Well, there is what the country looks like at this hour. It's a little after midnight in the east. And George Bush has 330 electoral votes. Michael Dukakis has 108, which, not that it's much consolation to him at this point, is more than he was projected to be getting in the final days of polling before the actual election. Some states, as of midnight Eastern Standard Time, that is to say as of 5 minutes ago, are still too close to call. Pennsylvania and Illinois, California and Hawaii, which is not on that map, which is over to one side, and Alaska is still too close to call.
Alaska we've got.
As of midnight. Have we just filled in Alaska?
Just filled.
We have.
Bush.
We filled it in for George Bush. And that is the status of our great board at this particular moment. Up in Boston, Sam Donaldson is with the man who did more than anything else to run Mike Dukakis' campaign through the primary and the caucus season, and then after a hiatus back on the presidential trail, John Sasso. Sam?
Well, Peter, John Sasso is really the architect of this campaign and is the governor's closest political advisor. You heard the vice president, the now president-elect Bush, say he wants to be president of all the people, including the Democrats. He commended Governor Dukakis for his campaign. What's your reaction to what you heard?
I thought he was very gracious, Sam, and he is going to be the president of all the American people, as Governor Dukakis said here tonight, and in that regard, we wish him well.
Mr. Sasso, you ran an honorable campaign. You did quite well, certainly far better than some of the pre-election polls suggested. You came so close, in other words, and yet so far. What went wrong?
Well, Sam, I think in the end, the American people voted for continuity today. The perceived prosperity and peace that the country is at. We have a very popular president, Ronald Reagan, the most popular in our lifetime, and George Bush was the heir apparent to that legacy, and I think in the end, that's what they voted for.
Yes, but a lot of people will say that this could have been won tactically, that in fact a lot of mistakes were made by Governor Dukakis and his staff. Do you plead guilty to any of them?
Yes, I think we made some mistakes, Sam, as the governor is himself admitted. I think we could have responded earlier to the distortions of Governor Dukakis' record. He's someone that has always wanted to define himself in positive terms, in terms of positive accomplishments, and he started out to do that, and his record was terribly distorted, and I'm not going to back away from that, even as I wish Vice President Bush well this evening. His record was distorted. He's got a good record, a record that we're proud of. And
well, now, let me just ask this quick question. You say you didn't start to respond early enough. A lot of people think that was Governor Dukakis' fault, that he overruled people like you who wanted to hit hard early.
No, that's not the case, Sam. He made his case very strongly and in a compelling way, particularly over these last 3 weeks. He fought to the end, right up until the moment the polls closed this evening, for the things that he believes in and has stood for 25 years in public life. And
if he asked your advice as to whether he should seek the nomination of his party again in 1992, what would you tell him?
I would say that this is not the time to make that kind of a judgment. He needs some time off. He's going to take that time off, and then he's going to get back to his job at the State House. And
sounds like you don't rule it out.
Well, I certainly wouldn't rule it out, but I haven't spoken to him about it, Sam. He's somebody that is optimistic, upbeat about this country. He's going to get back to his job tomorrow morning in the State House, and we'll see what the future holds.
Thank you very much, John Sasso, who is Governor Dukakis' principal architect for this campaign and closest political advisor. We wish you well. We wish the governor well. Thanks for coming up tonight and talking to us.
Thank you, Sam.
Gentlemen.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. Nothing more difficult, David, on an election night than to have to defend a defeat or explain away a defeat to people like us who want to know why you don't admit all of your mistakes at this moment.
Well, the usual way to do that is to blame it on somebody else.
Well,
which is very easy.
And you can see in John
somebody
Sasso
who's not there and is not going to respond.
It's all right. You can see it in John Sasso, too, there, because they really keep going back to this distortion of the governor's record, which they felt the Bush campaign had done. We want to make a call now in California in the Senate race. The incumbent, Pete Wilson. According to our projection, the Republican has staved off a very expensive attack from Leo McCarthy, the Democrat, the lieutenant governor, and that is, I think, by all accounts, the most expensive campaign in the nation, in a state where you have to campaign almost exclusively on television. That's where all the money goes in California. It goes into television. We project that Pete Wilson, the Republican incumbent, is going to hold his seat in the Senate, and we'll be back in 1 minute.
ABC News election night coverage of the 88 vote will continue in a moment.
We were talking just a moment ago about the Senate race in California. The incumbent Pete Wilson has retained his seat, and it reminded me of some of the figures we made about money. A record $130 million. About $9 a voter has been spent on advertising in California on the presidential race, the Senate race, and the congressional and the ballot proposition. The most expensive Senate race was, as we said, Pete Wilson's. $15 million spent on that race. Now, in Washington, there you see, I confess to our surprise, Senator Dan Quayle, Vice President-elect Dan Quayle, whose staff, and that's his wife Marilyn, whose campaign had been telling us all evening that he was not going to show up, that this was George Bush's night. And he's being greeted there by Frank Fahrenkopf. That, by the way, is Bush leaving Houston just as Quayle arrives at the Republican National Committee meeting place in Washington. These two only ran into each other a couple of times on the campaign trail over the last few months, and as David Brinkley was pointing out at the beginning, Senator Quayle campaigned well away from the major centers of the country. Here he is.
Thank you very much, and the only thing I can say is that you did it, we did it, and George Bush did it. Thank you very much. You have truly made this the most memorable night in our lives. And believe me, Marilyn, Tucker, Benjamin, and Corinne and I, we will never forget this night. We won't forget what you did for me and what you have done for George Bush. For nearly 3 months since our convention in August, we have witnessed firsthand the dedication and professionalism of literally thousands of supporters, volunteers, and staff members everywhere. Through 38 states, and for more than 235 separate appearances. So tonight, a salute to all who we never had a chance to meet or to say hello. Marilyn and I thank you so much for all you have done. And let me say a special thanks to a great wife, a great mother, and a great campaigner, Marilyn Quayle. A special thanks to my Senate staff, my campaign staff, and to all those back at headquarters who committed all their energies and devotion to the cause of this campaign. And before I say anything else, I think we in Washington ought to let them hear us in Houston, Texas.
Senator Dan Quayle sending a message down to Houston. Some mentioning thanks to his wife, by the way. There's some talk, not all of it serious, in fact not serious at all, that his wife might be one of the people considered to be appointed to his Senate seat, which will now be vacated. And the present governor, Governor Orr, the Republican, will make the appointment, so the Republicans will get that Senate seat there, and it will not have to be filled until, I think, a special election in about 1992, am I right, David?
Something like that, but Bush was careful to pick a candidate for vice president from a state where he would be replaced by a Republican if he won. So that was one clever aspect.
You think
of
Mr. Bush was that clever
well,
at the time?
don't have to be terribly clever to know that a Republican governor in Indiana will appoint a Republican senator.
Dan Quayle at 41 becomes the third youngest vice president-elect in the nation's history.
Okay.
You happy with that? Okay, I want to go back very quickly to George Will, because, George, as Sam Donaldson was talking to John Sasso about coming so close, I heard you groan in the background.
Well, they didn't come close. That's all. I mean, I look at the map, and it's very colorful red almost all over the place. It is, however, the case that Democrats do have some ways of taking consolation from the night. George Bush did not have coattails, Peter. The two states where I think people were looking for his coattails to show up if they were to exist were in the Senate races in Florida with Connie Mack, and the Senate race in New Jersey with Pete Dawkins, and both of those people lost, although Bush carried the states fairly easily. On the other hand, what really must worry Democrats tonight is this. We have not only a two-party system, increasingly we seem to have a two-tier system. That is, we have a presidential system and the Republicans dominate it, and we have a legislative system and the Democrats dominate it, but I do not think the Democrats want to become thought of as a merely legislative party.
Jeff Greenfield, we've only got a couple of minutes before this next commercial, but you heard George Bush talk about a gentler and kinder America. How long do you think it'll be before the nation begins to mend?
Well, no, I think the mending process is going to happen fairly soon, because we don't have ideological parties in the sense that they conduct permanent warfare. I think the question is that, unlike Ronald Reagan in 1980, George Bush does not come to Washington, in my view, with a coherent political ideological mandate. And you have had a Congress that has been increasingly assertive of its power against both Democratic and Republican presidents. The only exception being in the early part of Reagan's first term, when Reagan came in and said, I won on this ground, now let me have my tax cuts and defense build up. And the Congress, as Reagan likes to say, if they didn't see the light, they felt the heat. I don't think George Bush comes to Washington with anything like that kind of weaponry. This was an election about continuity. This was an election where we heard Bush supporters chanting 4 more years, a rather ironic cheer for a man who's not an incumbent. And I think the gains that the Democrats have made in Congress are going to make it very hard for Bush to come in and say, read my lips, enact my program.
Okay, Jeff, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire a little bit when we come back, though, because there are people in the country who think that George Bush won not in a landslide, but as someone said, in a mudslide. Before we go away, one of those that's been too close to call, Pennsylvania, we now project for George Bush, which means in shorthand that Michael Dukakis did not win enough in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, particularly to offset the Republican gains out in rural Pennsylvania, but you can see how close it was and why it has taken us this long to call it, waiting for 91% of the vote to be counted and returned. We are going to cut away now so that you can have a chance to take a closer look at the local races in your neighborhood and the propositions on your ballot, but we will be back. And we hope you will join me, David Brinkley, Jeff Greenfield, and everybody here as our election coverage continues.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the 88 vote. With Sam Donaldson at the Dukakis headquarters in Boston, Brit Hume at the Bush headquarters in Houston, James Wooten and Barry Serafin on Capitol Hill, Lynn Scherr and Jeff Greenfield in New York. And now reporting from the ABC News Election Night Command Center, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Just before we go any farther, David, you have another projection.
I do indeed. Governor of Montana, a Republican elected there. They don't do that much. Governor Stan Stevens, a Republican candidate for governor in Montana, elected.
As of 12:30, Illinois, California, Hawaii. Am I including Hawaii? No, Hawaii's been, yes, and Hawaii are still too close to call. It really may be in part in Hawaii because the results have not come in. But in Illinois and California, it is still too close to call. But as of now, if you take a look at our big board, George Bush has 355 electoral votes. He has made his acceptance speech. Michael Dukakis has made his concession speech. There's quite a lot to talk about in the next half hour, our last half hour. But we want to get caught up on some of the other races in the country. Let's begin with the Senate and go to Washington and ABC's Jim Wooten, who is there. Jim?
Well, Peter, there are a few people who have familiar faces who won't be around. Among them, John Stennis, who's retiring, Lawton Chiles, who's retiring, and several others. But let's take a look at how the Senate is going to change in terms of party switches in states. The Republicans have picked up states in Mississippi and Montana. The Democrats have picked up states in Connecticut, Virginia, and Nebraska. That's a total gain for the Republicans of 2, for the Democrats of 3, which gives the Democrats a net gain of 1. That gives them a 55-45 majority in the Senate. It's likely to stay that way because we've called 30 of the 33 races. The 3 remaining races, that's Hecht in Nevada, Wilson in California, and up in Washington, Slade Gorton, all Republicans, all leading and looking like they may pull it off.
I must confess, gentlemen? I think, Jim, in California, we've actually projected Pete Wilson, the Republican, to hold his seat, haven't we? We haven't projected in Washington State yet.
I was thinking of Wallop in Wyoming. Sorry, Peter.
Okie dokie. And Chick Hecht in Nevada, who's having a real struggle. Actually, we will project Wallop now. Do you want to give us the details on that one, Jim?
Well, Malcolm Wallop was expected to win all along. That race has not been in much question, and it doesn't really change anything. It doesn't change the kind of Senate that President-elect Bush will face when he gets here in January. Not much different than the Senate that President Reagan has faced for the last few years. Assertive, independent, generally middle of the road.
Okay, the only one you didn't mention, which from my own personal point of view, a highly visible person in the Senate, William Proxmire of Wisconsin. He's retiring, said he didn't want to be accused of staying around too long, but he, the famous William Proxmire of the Golden Fleece Award, once a month, in which he highlighted that institution or department in government which he thought was wasting the taxpayers' money. And David, I'm told he may continue that Golden Fleece Award when he is out of government.
From his home in Wisconsin?
He may well.
Well, I don't know. I was wondering if somebody would carry it on. It always made a nice little story about once a month.
You were following some figures in the House, I know, before we go to Barry Serafin.
Well, I have a number here that I know everyone has been waiting for.
Absolutely.
What percentage of members of the House running for re-election won?
Tell us.
99%.
Well, no need talking to Barry Serafin.
There's really nothing left to say, is there?
Well, Barry, let's put you on the stick in Washington. Who in the 1% didn't make it?
Well, Peter, that's an important question, and we ought to do a little catching up in that regard. As you have made plain, the cast isn't going to change much. The major players will be back, Jim Wright and Bob Michael and people like that. But a couple of incumbents got tripped up tonight by controversy. Let's go to that race we talked about earlier, which is the Georgia 4th District. That's where Republican Congressman Pat Swindle has lost. Swindle, as we noted earlier, is under indictment for perjury, for lying to a grand jury. This has been a very nasty race. Ben Jones, the Democrat who has won that race, you may remember, is an actor. He played a character named Cooter on the TV series Dukes of Hazzard. Swindle, despite all the controversy he was getting, I guess wasn't going to take all the heat himself. He tried to label Jones in this race as dishonest, an alcoholic, a wife-beater. And Jones, in Cooter-like fashion, replied that being called dishonest by Swindle is like being called ugly by a possum. Anyway, Jones is the winner down there.
Sounds like your favorite race of the evening, Barry.
Well, I like that one a lot. Now, there's another race that we really need to take note of tonight, and that's in Rhode Island's 1st District. Here is where a Democratic incumbent, Ferdinand St. Germain, he's been around in Congress a very long time. He was seeking his 15th term. He's chairman of the House Banking Committee, and he has lost. St. Germain has been shadowed by ethics questions. Those relate to meals and entertainment that he accepted from members of the savings and loan industry, and he's now out. He's the first chairman of a standing committee to lose in the House since 1980. Gentlemen.
Okay, Barry, I just wanted to know about Rhode Island. Senator Chaffee up in Rhode Island held his seat. He'd been challenged very hard by the Lieutenant Governor Richard Light, or Licht, I'm not sure exactly, I apologize how to pronounce it, Licht. But he held his seat there despite some very determined opposition that he should leave the Washington scene. In a minute, we're going to get a real chance to talk to Lynn Scherr, who's been sort of our dean of numerology around here. She's going to tell us how people voted, how the young voted, how blacks voted, how women voted, on what issues they voted. But we'll be right back. Well, with 67% of the precincts reporting in, George Bush is getting about 54% of the vote. Michael Dukakis is getting about 46% of the vote. But who is voting for whom? We judge this not only by the raw numbers, of course, but by the exit polls, and Lynn sure watches over them for us. Lynn, start by telling us how much you've learned, which I suspect is a lot.
We've learned quite a lot, Peter, with hardly any time to get it all on the air, I'm afraid. But let me start by telling you a little bit about issues. We took a look at some of those rather untraditional issues that the candidates were stressing, and we decided to see how they were playing. Did voters care about them? Well, on these key issues, let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Only 12% said they thought it was important. Prison furloughs, remember the ad? Another 12%. Incidentally, on both of those, the majority went for Bush. On Dan Quayle, 12%. Only 12% said Dan Quayle was important, and by the way, most of them voted for Dukakis, but the point there is Dan Quayle simply did not hurt George Bush. Now we can take a look at the key issues that were important. According to our polling, 32% said abortion was important. This is really quite a change from 1984. It is twice as many people as then, and by the way, most of them voted for Bush. 26% said the death penalty was important. They also went for Bush. Drugs was another 26% said drugs were important, and that was a tie. Overall, the number one concern was the national economy. The number two concern was the national defense. Bush did very comfortably and won in both of these things. But in the end, the real point is no issue dominated. In fact, the only thing that stands out in this election in terms of why people voted for someone is they said voters cited George Bush's experience as the reason why they voted for him. Peter?
Now, Lynn, you've been wading up to your neck in figures, numbers, not only this year but in past election years. What came out this time that surprised you in all those figures?
Well, there have been some changes, David and Peter. What Ronald Reagan did in 1984, based on what he had done in 1980, was to essentially turn this country around. The coalition of Democrats that used to be strictly Democratic, blue-collar, ethnic, Catholics, they all switched over to, a lot of them switched over to the Reagan camp. We are beginning to see a little bit of movement back to the Democrats. Dukakis seems to have brought the Catholics home. There has also been a change in terms of the way some of the age groups voted.
How'd the young vote, Lynn?
Well, the young people, 18 to 24, split their vote this year. That is a loss for the Democrats because in 1984, Mondale got 59 and Reagan got 40. So in that regard, the Democrats did not do so well.
Let me come back to issues with you for a second, because
Okay.
I want to cite my own unscientific trip around the country where I found the deficit to be number one and the homeless number two. I haven't heard it mentioned, or the poor in your assessment.
The deficit and the homeless, which we do as a question, taking care of the poor, did not do particularly well. The only people that cited those, the people who cited those, and the numbers were, I think, around 14% or something like that. Most of them voted for Dukakis on both of those issues. So they cut for Dukakis, but not nearly enough in order to make a difference in this election.
Okay, Lynn, thanks very much indeed. Appreciate that. By the way, speaking of what cuts for Dukakis and what doesn't, we're going to go away for another minute. And when we come back, we're going to talk to our political director, Hal Bruno, who watches this thing like a hawk. He's our dean. And he will tell us, I think, just how close it was in many of those states and how it might have gone, in his view, if Dukakis had worked harder. We'll be right back. Well, I guess we would have to call this, David, the Last Straw Award. Marianne Keeley, who's covered Jesse Jackson for us from the very beginning, says that Jesse Jackson tonight called George Bush to congratulate her. Did not call Michael Dukakis.
Really?
Really. So we're told by our reporter who's been with Jesse Jackson relentlessly from day one.
Well, if she said it, I believe it. But
So do
that's
I.
very odd.
So do I.
Very odd.
All right. Let's turn to Hal Bruno, our political director. It is Hal to whom we respond day in and day out, and who knows every political operative in the country. And if I hear you correctly, sitting down there behind me, you think that Dukakis could have pulled this out if he'd only done some things and listened to some other people.
I think a lot of the Democratic Party feel that way, and I think tomorrow you're going to see the recriminations happening, because they're going to look at a lot of these states like Pennsylvania, where it was within fractions, Illinois, which is still can't be called and is close, states like Michigan and New Jersey, Maryland, a state that was inexcusable for a Democrat to lose. And what they're going to say, what they've said tonight, is that if Dukakis had not wasted August and September, if he had immediately responded to Bush, not allowed him to get the momentum, if he had not wasted his time chasing votes in southern states that there was no hope of winning, if all of these things had been done early on, if their phone calls had been returned, it could have been a win for the Democrats.
Can you give us some specific examples of states where they begged him to come, because I know there are some, and he didn't show up?
Well, Pennsylvania is a good example, where at Labor Day...
Can we put up the Pennsylvania board while you're talking about this? Go ahead, Hal, sorry.
Well, you may recall in the latter part of August, Dukakis was in Massachusetts, and he was touring Massachusetts, and he wanted to work that week as governor. And there were pleas from Ohio, from Pennsylvania, from Illinois, from Michigan, all of these big battleground states. Why are you there? Why are you not out here? In the meantime, George Bush came out of his convention with a full head of steam. He didn't wait for Labor Day for the campaign to start. He went from his convention to the campaign trail, and he never stopped.
But there's a certain irony here. Here is the governor of a state who said he will campaign for the presidency and still continue to maintain his responsible position in the state, and he gets knocked because he did that.
Well, it was unrealistic to think that you can maintain your position as governor and be active as a governor in a state and campaign for president at the same time.
Well, George Bush had a job of which nothing is required.
That's right. But Dukakis realistically had to say to the people of Massachusetts, look, for the next couple of months, I can't be a full-time governor. I've got to be a full-time candidate.
So in a phrase, what do you think we're going to be hearing from Democrats over the next weeks and months?
Well, you're going to hear a lot of bitterness toward Dukakis. Then you're going to have a fight within the party, with the Southerners saying, see, we told you so, with the others saying, well, look, we gave you a vice presidential candidate from the South. The whole convention was geared to the South. The Dukakis message until the last 2 weeks of the campaign was geared to the South. And what did it get us? Not one single state. So in addition to wanting to get their have their word with Michael Dukakis, the Democrats are also once again going to be going at each other.
Hal, thank you. And also, while I have you here, thank you for all the stuff that only we know you did this year. Hal Bruno, our political director, to whom we're always indebted. A final word from Boston from Sam Donaldson. Sam, you've been listening to our leader here. What do you think?
Well, Peter, I want to sort of second what Hal has just said, because I'd like to defend myself against George Will's, my good friend's groan earlier when I said that John Sasso, Dukakis' architect of his campaign, that so near and yet so far. If you take some of those states, we're going to find that Bush won them very narrowly rather than by a big blowout. And I agree. I think this campaign probably could have been won tactically. Not only would it have taken an earlier effort by Dukakis, a finer message sharpened and honed, an attack message to respond to Bush's negative ads on Dukakis, but it would have taken more cooperation earlier from Jesse Jackson, a man that we've talked about some tonight, a man who says perhaps he'll get in it tomorrow, if not for himself, at least for the cause. Jackson could have started earlier, but instead he played a little bit of divisiveness there, and that hurt Dukakis. I want to tell you one thing finally, if I may. Anyone who suggests that Bush's victory, and I don't know that anyone has done that tonight, but you sort of hear it in the background, is another victory to show that conservatism in this country is on the march, ought to take a look at what happened between 1984 and 1988. Ronald Reagan won 49 states. Now, if that was a conservative victory and was on the march, what happened to George Bush? Well, I think, Peter, quite clearly, Reagan is a phenomenon. Now, it's not altogether a personal victory for him. He represented great ideological properties, and people responded to that. But there's no one like Ronald Reagan. George Bush certainly isn't like him. Michael Dukakis isn't like him. But I think this election would, in one sense, if you have to lose it, give some heart to the Democrats. They're not washed up as a political party. And I think if there is a recession, as a lot of people predict, President Bush in 1992 may have his hands full to be reelected.
Sam, I want to ask you one question about the campaign. When did the Dukakis people realize that this was not a campaign about competence, but one about ideology?
Well, I think some of them realized it earlier than others, and I think one of those who was the last to realize it, unfortunately for the campaign, was Michael S. Dukakis. I think the stories are true. I've heard them from just a number of people, and I think that they're correct. That early on, when people like Sasso wanted to hit back on those negative ads, Dukakis still wanted to take the high ground. Now, we've heard from Mario Cuomo, the very distinguished governor of New York, who's admitted publicly that he was one of those who advised Dukakis, you don't have to worry about this. Cuomo said, the American people will never buy this. Well, enough of the American people bought it so that the negatives were in concrete before Dukakis came down off the high ground and said, well, I've got to scrap it up. It was only late September that you began to sense some scrappiness in the Dukakis camp.
Thanks, Sam, very much indeed. Appreciate it. Let's go back down to Houston now and talk to Britt Hume. Britt, chart the future for us, at least in the short run. You said earlier that you thought George Bush would take the high ground. He sounded like it in his acceptance speech. He's not going to think he has a mandate, surely, is he?
Well, he certainly isn't going to think he has any coattails based on the results that we've seen in the Senate races and the congressional races tonight. There's been nothing to suggest that. He'll have a news conference tomorrow, and I suspect that the kind of tone that he struck here tonight will continue. I'd like to, if I might, Peter, enter a mild word of dissent to the wisdom that has been articulated by my colleagues Sam and Hal. I think that we who cover politics and those who we talk to all the time who work in it like to believe that what we cover, and those who work in it like to believe that what they do really make a huge difference. I suspect that when the history of all this time is written, that larger forces will be seen as having had a greater effect on this than this tactical decision or that trip made or not made. And I look at the situation that George Bush inherited. Indeed, it was even more auspicious for an incumbent party than was the situation Ronald Reagan had in 1984. The economy really is in better shape in terms of unemployment than it was then. The situation in the world could not have broken better for George Bush if he'd prayed for it and had his prayers answered. And look what happened just last week. On Thursday or Friday morning, the unemployment figures came out, and we were at a 14-year low. I mean, that's the kind of luck that a candidate prays for. So I think there was a lot of good backdrop in terms of the conditions of the country that helped George Bush. But there was one critical mistake I think his opposition made, and it echoed through that Atlanta convention. They thought George Bush was a man who couldn't hit the floor with his hat. And he turned out to be a more aggressive, a more fiery, and at critical moments, even a more eloquent campaigner than they ever imagined. And I'm not sure they ever quite recovered from that.
But who would have ever have guessed it, Britt?
Well, I covered him in 1980, and I must say to you, Peter, that this man is a very different fellow than he was then. He is more conservative, and I think genuinely so. I think his convictions have changed, and he's tougher than he was then. He was urged repeatedly in 1980 by his advisors to go on the attack against Ronald Reagan. He wouldn't do it. Now, as things turned out, I suppose we could say tonight it was the wise thing to do. But when he was urged in 1980 to go after Bob Dole, he did it, and it worked, and it was the kind of thing that I don't think he could possibly have done 8 years ago.
Okay,
he's
Britt.
a different guy.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Thanks very much, Britt. You mentioned news conferences. Tomorrow there are going to be a couple of news conferences. Somebody will tell me in my ear. George Bush, at 10 o'clock tomorrow Eastern Time, George Bush is going to give a news conference, and then Michael Dukakis is going to give a news conference, well, at approximately 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and we will carry them both live. And then tomorrow night, Nightline is going to become Viewpoint, where Ted Koppel and a panel of critics will sit down and discuss this election, covering politics. Who's to Blame is the title. That'll be at 11:30 or in the regular Nightline slot, wherever you get it around the country. I want to turn finally here to Jeff Greenfield tonight to ask you, Jeff, if you thought there were some particular shaping events for George Bush this year which we should not forget.
I want to think of two in the election campaign. First, the acceptance speech, one of the great acceptance speeches in the last 2 decades, in which George Bush took all of his weaknesses and explained them away. I'm not a wimp. I was loyal to the president. Now you must see me as I am. Michael Dukakis wouldn't define himself on ideology. I'll define him, and I'll define myself. It was an absolute shaping moment that gave him definition. The second one I would mention, because the first one was scripted by a speechwriter, was the second debate, when George Bush clearly bested Michael Dukakis and put a lot of doubts to rest. He took the premises that Britt Hume talked about, peace and prosperity, a desire for continuity, and gave the public, gave the voters a reason to say, it's okay. You can stay with me, I'm competent, and I care for you. Those were the two events that I think were the most successful for George Bush. Peter, David?
Jeff, thanks very much indeed. Just somebody we haven't mentioned much tonight, Ronald Reagan. He and Mrs. Reagan watched the returns quietly tonight, so we are told, from California, where he ended the campaign stumping for George Bush. We can now call Hawaii for Mr. Dukakis, those 4 electoral votes, normally a Democratic state. And let's just take one quick look at the Illinois board, because Illinois has been troubling us all evening. It's still just about 50-50 there, with 66% of the vote counted. That great bellwether state at the heart of the Midwest remains exactly where it is. David, a final comment.
Well, the Reagans are saying that they look forward to the privacy of returning to California. They all say that when they leave, even though they have spent half their lives and millions of dollars trying to escape the privacy. That's it. All right, all right.
As always, I want to thank you. It is an enormous privilege to sit beside you all year, especially late in the evening when I get to embarrass you by saying that.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're wonderful,
Pleasure.
David. What to say in conclusion? Don't know. Thanks, really, to most of the people. Perhaps we'll all think in the days ahead to keep George Bush's feet to the fire on whether it will be a kinder and gentler America. And we'll look back at these exit polls and remind the new president when his time comes that the American people still think there's a mountain of debt out there with which he has to deal. And, of course, the press corps, if it gives him a honeymoon at all, we'll soon want to know whether or not we should still read his lips in the Bush administration or whether there are taxes in our future. At any rate, George Bush, the vice president, becomes the president-elect in this November of 1988. To all of the people at ABC News, thank you very much. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. On behalf of all my colleagues, good night. I'm Peter Jennings.